What if the greatest breakthrough in human history didn't happen in the future, but thousands of years ago? Across the world stand monuments that continue to challenge archaeology, engineering, and even our understanding of ancient civilization. Their builders shaped mountains into temples, fitted multi-ton stones with astonishing precision, and created structures that have survived for millennia, while the knowledge behind them quietly disappeared. Every new discovery reveals remarkable skill, yet the most important questions remain unanswered. How did they achieve feats that still seem extraordinary today? And why did the methods used to create them vanish almost completely from history? These ancient places are more than impressive ruins. They're reminders that the past may still hold chapters of human achievement we have yet to understand. Stone spheres of Diquis, scattered across the Diquis Delta in southern Costa Rica, present one of archaeology's most enduring engineering puzzles. Hundreds of nearly perfect stone spheres lie across a tropical landscape, yet no surviving written record explains who designed them, how they were produced with such precision, or why an ancient society invested extraordinary effort into objects that appear to serve no obvious practical purpose. The modern story began during the late 1940s when workers employed by the United Fruit Company cleared dense rainforest to establish banana plantations in the Diquis Delta. Bulldozers exposed dozens of massive stone spheres buried beneath centuries of vegetation, while archaeologists soon recognized that these were not isolated curiosities, but part of an extensive prehistoric cultural landscape. Subsequent investigations led by Samuel K. Lothrop of Harvard University's Peabody Museum documented many of the discoveries, although the opportunity to study countless spheres in their original positions had already been lost because heavy machinery had moved them before proper archaeological recording could begin. Even today, despite decades of excavation, the discoveries continue to raise more questions than answers. Radiocarbon dating of associated archaeological deposits places the principal production of the spheres between approximately AD 600 and 1500 ***, during the Chiriqui cultural tradition that flourished in southern Costa Rica before European contact. More than ***300 spheres have now been recorded, ranging from only a few centimeters in diameter to over ***2.5 meters ***, with the largest weighing close to ***, 15 metric tons ***. Most were carved from granodiorite, an exceptionally hard, intrusive igneous rock originating in the foothills of the nearby Talamanca Mountains, while smaller examples were fashioned from gabbro or limestone. Those measurements alone reveal an astonishing investment of labor, but the greatest mystery emerges only after examining their geometry. The most difficult question confronting archaeologists is not why the spheres exist, but how prehistoric craftsmen achieved such remarkable accuracy without metal tools, precision measuring instruments, or written mathematical systems. Many of the best preserved examples approach an almost perfect spherical form, displaying consistent curvature across their surfaces that remains impressive even when evaluated using modern three-dimensional scanning technologies. Contrary to popular myths, not every sphere is flawless, and detailed digital surveys have shown that some possess slight irregularities caused by weathering or incomplete finishing. Even so, numerous specimens remain extraordinarily close to true spheres, despite having been produced centuries before precision engineering was thought possible in this region. Archaeologists generally propose that artisans first fractured large boulders, using repeated heating and rapid cooling, then shaped the stone with hammerstones, before gradually refining the surface through prolonged abrasion using smaller stones, sand, and water. The hypothesis is physically plausible, yet no excavation has uncovered a complete workshop demonstrating every stage of production, nor have archaeologists recovered specialized templates, measuring devices or experimental evidence proving that this method alone could repeatedly achieve the remarkable consistency visible across hundreds of enormous objects. The technological gap between what is theoretically possible and what has actually been demonstrated continues to define the central mystery of the stone spheres of Dikis. That uncertainty becomes even greater when attention shifts from manufacture to transportation. Geological analysis has traced many granodiorite spheres to quarries located in the Talamanca foothills. In some cases, ***, 10 to more than 50 kilometers ***, from where the finished monuments were eventually placed. Between those source outcrops and the archaeological sites stretches one of Central America's most demanding environments, consisting of dense tropical rainforest, rivers, marshlands, and seasonally flooded plains. The society responsible possessed neither wheeled vehicles nor draft animals capable of pulling multi-ton loads across such terrain. Yet some of the heaviest spheres ultimately reached elevated ridges, village plazas, and carefully prepared architectural settings, rather than remaining close to the quarries. Experimental archaeology suggests that large workforces using wooden rollers, sledges, ropes, and earthen ramps might have accomplished the task, but no preserved transport roads, engineered ramps, or hauling installations have been identified. The absence of direct archaeological evidence leaves the logistical achievement largely unexplained, especially considering that some individual stones weigh as much as a modern city bus. As excavations expanded, researchers discovered that the spheres were not always positioned randomly across the landscape. Several remained associated with ancient settlements, where they appeared in straight lines, triangular arrangements, rectangular groupings, or formal plazas. Such geometric placement immediately suggested deliberate planning rather than casual decoration. Unfortunately, the archaeological record had already suffered irreversible damage because countless spheres were relocated during agricultural development throughout the 20th century. Some became ornaments in private gardens, others were installed outside government buildings or hotels, and many disappeared entirely from their original contexts. Early field notes recorded alignments that seemed remarkably precise, yet later researchers often found only empty spaces where crucial evidence had once existed. Whether these arrangements expressed political authority, ceremonial organization, territorial boundaries, or sophisticated spatial planning, therefore, remains impossible to determine with confidence, because much of the contextual information vanished before systematic archaeological documentation became standard practice. The question of purpose has consequently become one of the longest-running debates in American archaeology. One interpretation proposes that the larger spheres symbolize the authority of elite families whose residences occupied the surrounding settlements. Another suggests that the monuments marked important ceremonial spaces where political gatherings reinforced social hierarchy. Some researchers have explored possible astronomical relationships, arguing that certain alignments may have referenced solar events or significant directions on the landscape, although current evidence remains insufficient to demonstrate intentional celestial observation. Others emphasize the symbolic significance of the sphere itself, noting that perfectly rounded forms frequently represented concepts of completeness, cosmic order, or sacred power in many ancient societies around the world. Every hypothesis possesses elements consistent with the available evidence, yet none explains every known site. The greatest obstacle is that the people who created the spheres left no surviving written language capable of revealing their intentions, While Spanish colonization during the 16th century rapidly transformed and ultimately dismantled the indigenous societies of the Diquis region before their traditions could be recorded in detail. Whatever meaning these monuments once carried disappeared together with the cultural knowledge required to interpret them. Adding another layer of uncertainty is the remarkable scale of investment represented by each sphere. Producing a monument weighing up to 15 tons required quarrying hard igneous rock, transporting it across difficult terrain, shaping it with extraordinary care, and finally positioning it within a carefully organized settlement. Such an undertaking demanded coordination, skilled labor, and substantial resources over extended periods. Yet, unlike defensive walls, irrigation systems, or monumental temples, the finished spheres provided no immediately obvious practical benefit. They were neither fortifications nor dwellings, neither agricultural tools nor sculpted representations of rulers or deities. Archaeology, therefore, confronts an unusual paradox, an enormous technological commitment devoted to creating objects whose primary function remains elusive. The more impressive the engineering becomes, the more difficult it is to explain the motivation behind it. Modern scientific research has revealed important details while leaving the central mystery unresolved. High-resolution 3D laser scanning has measured the spheres with remarkable precision. Petrographic analysis has confirmed the origin of the stone, and radiocarbon dating has refined the chronology of nearby settlements. UNESCO designated the pre-Columbian chiefdom settlements with stone spheres of the Diquis a World Heritage Site in 2014, yet archaeologists still cannot fully explain how the spheres were made, transported, or what they originally meant. The Kaimanawa Wall stands within dense forest south of Lake Taupo on New Zealand's North Island, where an exposed rock face appears to have been assembled from enormous rectangular blocks. Although local foresters and residents had known about the formation earlier, it attracted international attention in the mid-1990s after New Zealand researcher Barry Brailsford and American alternative history writer David Hatcher Childress examined it and argued that its geometric surface might represent the remains of a human-built megalithic structure. Their claim transformed an obscure volcanic outcrop into a dispute capable of challenging the accepted chronology of human settlement in New Zealand. The visible section resembles several courses of masonry extending across the slope. Horizontal fractures divide the rock into broad layers, while vertical cracks break those layers into shapes that can look remarkably similar to fitted stone blocks. Some exposed faces appear almost flat, several intersections approach right angles, and vegetation conceals the continuation of the formation beneath the surrounding soil. From certain viewing positions, the surface looks less like a broken cliff than the outer wall of a buried structure whose upper levels have disappeared into the hillside. That appearance created the central controversy. Brailsford and Childress argued that the arrangement was too regular to be accidental, and suggested that the wall could predate the arrival of the ancestors of Maori. Under the archaeological chronology supported by current evidence, East Polynesian settlers reached New Zealand during the late 13th century, with permanent settlement developing rapidly afterward. A genuinely ancient stone monument beneath the Kaimanawa forest would therefore require either an unexpectedly early Polynesian presence or an unidentified population reaching the islands before them. Either possibility would alter one of the most intensively studied migration histories in the Pacific. The proposal became especially provocative because monumental block masonry is not characteristic of known prehistoric construction in New Zealand. Maori communities created fortified PA, terraces, storage pits, houses, defensive earthworks, and carefully engineered landscapes. But no securely dated Maori site contains masonry resembling the supposed wall. Supporters interpreted this absence as evidence that the builders belonged to another culture. Archaeologists interpreted it differently. If an unknown society had quarried, shaped and positioned such large stones, it should also have left tools, occupation deposits, food remains, hearths, paths, quarries or comparable structures elsewhere. None of that evidence has been recovered from the Kaimanawa Formation. No associated artifact assemblage has established human construction. No buried cultural layer has produced a date, and no tool marks have been demonstrated on the exposed surfaces. There is also no verified foundation trench, prepared platform or construction debris surrounding the supposed blocks. These absences do not mathematically prove that people never modified the site, but they leave the human-built interpretation without the normal archaeological evidence required to identify a monument. The geological explanation begins with an eruption far older than any possible human occupation of New Zealand. The formation consists of Rangitaiki ignimbrita, welded volcanic material produced approximately 330,000 years ago within the Taupo volcanic zone. Ignimbrite forms when immense pyroclastic currents of hot ash, gas and fragmented rock travel outward from an explosive eruption and accumulate in thick deposits. While still hot, the particles can weld together into a dense mass that later behaves like solid rock. Ignimbrite sheets in the central North Island can reach enormous thicknesses and dominate entire plateau landscapes around the volcanic zone. As the deposit cooled and contracted, internal stress generated fractures. Cooling joints commonly develop in roughly vertical and horizontal directions, especially where the rock contains differences in density, temperature, or welding. Erosion then exploits those fractures, removing weaker material and exposing rows of apparently separate blocks. Similar processes can create natural columns, pavements, and wall-like cliffs, whose geometry looks deliberately engineered, even though no stone was ever quarried or moved. Geologist Peter Wood of the former Institute of Geological and Nuclear Sciences and archaeologist Neville Ritchie inspected the Kaimanawa exposure during the height of the controversy. Their observations supported a natural origin. Ritchie noted that the supposed courses were not consistently level, the vertical divisions were not truly perpendicular, and the shapes became less regular when examined closely rather than through selected photographs. More importantly, small irregularities on opposite sides of fractures appeared to match. A projection on one surface corresponded with a depression on the neighbouring surface, indicating that both sides had once formed a continuous mass before the rock split apart. Carefully fitted masonry usually shows separate stones shaped to meet one another. Matching fracture surfaces instead reveal a single body of rock, divided by natural stress. The formation's apparent precision is also affected by perspective. Soil and moss hide the lower edges, preventing observers from seeing whether the supposed blocks continue independently below ground. Weathering emphasizes the deepest fractures while obscuring smaller cracks, producing a simplified pattern of large rectangles. Photographs taken directly in front of the exposure compress its uneven depth and make separate surfaces appear aligned. Once the surrounding outcrop, loose fragments and irregular jointing are included. The structure resembles fractured ignimbrite more closely than organized architecture. Yet one unresolved demand has kept the controversy alive. Why not excavate the base and settle the matter directly? Supporters of the artificial wall hypothesis have repeatedly argued that only excavation could reveal whether the visible face continues downward as stacked blocks or merges into unbroken bedrock. They suggest that soil may conceal foundations, additional courses, or cultural material capable of identifying builders. Because no extensive archaeological excavation has exposed the entire base, the buried geometry has remained central to alternative interpretations. Archaeologists answer that excavation is not automatically required whenever natural rock resembles construction. Fieldwork is destructive, costly and normally justified by evidence indicating archaeological potential. At Kaimanawa, geological inspection already identified the material, the fracture process and matching surfaces consistent with an intact ignimbrite outcrop. Digging beside it would not change the volcanic age of the rock and would only demonstrate human construction if it uncovered unmistakable modification or associated cultural deposits. So far, surface examination has provided no compelling archaeological signal demanding a major excavation. The lack of excavation nevertheless creates a narrow space between what has been strongly explained and what has been physically exposed. Geological evidence can account for the wall-like pattern, but only complete subsurface examination could display every buried connection. This distinction is often exaggerated into a claim that scientists remain unable to explain the site. In reality, the scientific interpretation is highly consistent. The Kaimanawa Wall is a naturally jointed volcanic outcrop. What remains uncertain is not the basic geological mechanism, but whether people ever interacted with, altered, or assigned significance to the formation after it appeared in the landscape. That possibility is more credible than the idea of an entirely constructed megalithic wall, although it also lacks direct evidence. Human communities frequently incorporated unusual natural formations into ritual landscapes without building them from the ground up. A naturally fractured cliff could have been visited, cleared, marked, or used as a territorial reference. Such activity might leave only subtle traces, especially in a wet forest environment where organic material decomposes and volcanic soils are repeatedly disturbed by roots, erosion, and later land use. Without excavation, dating samples or diagnostic artifacts, even limited human modification cannot be completely excluded. Pisco geoglyphs on Peru's arid Pacific coast preserve one of archaeology's most perplexing ancient landmarks. Towering above the Paracas Peninsula is a colossal figure carved into a steep sandy hillside, visible from far out at sea yet still resisting a definitive explanation after more than 2,000 years. The modern story began when Spanish sailors navigating the Peruvian coast recorded the enormous hillside figure as a recognizable landmark, long before archaeologists understood its antiquity. Systematic archaeological work during the 20th century linked the geoglyph to the Paracas cultural sphere, whose civilization flourished roughly between 800 BCE and 100 BCE, although no excavation has ever produced direct evidence identifying the people who designed it or documenting the reason for its construction. Unlike temples, tombs, or settlements that gradually reveal their history through inscriptions or artifacts, the geoglyph offers almost no written clues, leaving researchers to reconstruct its past almost entirely from its landscape. Construction techniques and environmental context. Known today as the Paracas candelabra, the figure measures approximately 181 meters in height and nearly 74 meters across. Its grooves reach depths of around half a meter to more than 1 meter, creating sharply defined channels cut directly into the compacted sand and underlying sediments. The design resembles a giant three-branched candelabrum, although others have compared it to a trident, a sacred staff, a cactus, or a stylized tree. None of these interpretations has gained universal acceptance, because no surviving Paracas artwork depicts an identical symbol, and no associated texts exist to explain its meaning. That absence of cultural context has transformed a seemingly simple image into one of the greatest unanswered questions surrounding ancient South America. What continues to challenge archaeology even more than its symbolism is its astonishing state of preservation. More than 2 millennia have passed since the hillside was carved, yet the immense figure remains remarkably recognizable despite occupying what appears to be an unstable slope of loose coastal sand. Under ordinary conditions, wind erosion, gravity, and seasonal environmental changes should gradually soften the edges until the entire design disappears beneath shifting sediment. Instead, the outline remains strikingly clear, raising the question that has fascinated both geologists and archaeologists alike. Why has this fragile monument survived for so long when countless other earthworks have vanished? Scientific investigation suggests that the answer lies partly within one of the driest environments on Earth. The Paracas Peninsula belongs to the hyper-arid coastal desert, influenced by the cold Humboldt Current, where average annual rainfall often measures only a few millimeters. Some years pass with virtually no measurable precipitation at all. Without regular rainfall, the destructive cycles of water infiltration, runoff, and soil collapse are dramatically reduced. At the same time, the hillside contains compacted layers beneath its loose surface, allowing excavated grooves to maintain their shape far longer than expected. Strong coastal winds, surprisingly, may also contribute to preservation rather than destruction, because prevailing air currents tend to sweep loose sand away instead of depositing thick layers into the carved channels. Salt-rich surface crusts produced by marine aerosols further stabilize portions of the sediment, limiting erosion that would otherwise blur the design. Even with these environmental advantages, however, researchers acknowledge that no existing geological model fully explains why the geoglyph has retained such extraordinary clarity over more than 20 centuries. Similar desert conditions elsewhere have not always produced monuments with comparable longevity, suggesting that the original builders may have understood the local terrain far better than modern observers initially assumed. That possibility naturally leads to another mystery. Constructing a figure almost 200 meters tall on a steep hillside required remarkable planning despite the obvious inability to view the complete design from ground level. Standing within the grooves themselves provides no sense of the finished image, making accurate proportions extremely difficult to achieve without some form of surveying system. Yet, excavations have uncovered no permanent guideposts, measuring grids, or construction markers that reveal how ancient engineers controlled symmetry across such a vast surface. The branches extend with impressive consistency while maintaining balanced spacing, implying careful geometric planning rather than improvisation. Whether the builders relied on ropes, wooden stakes, astronomical alignments, or techniques now lost remains entirely unknown. Its location creates another puzzle that archaeology has never fully resolved. Unlike the famous Nazca Lines, which occupy relatively flat desert plains, the Paracas candelabra faces directly toward the Pacific Ocean. From nearby ground level, the figure is difficult to appreciate in its entirety, but from offshore it dominates the coastline and can be recognized from distances exceeding 20 kilometers under favorable visibility. This orientation has inspired generations of competing interpretations. Some scholars believe it served as a navigational landmark for ancient mariners traveling along Peru's coast. Others suggest it marked a ceremonial landscape associated with coastal rituals or religious processions directed toward the sea. Alternative theories connect it with sacred mountains, astronomical symbolism, or regional political identity. Every proposal explains part of the evidence while leaving equally significant questions unanswered, primarily because no associated harbour, ceremonial complex, or written record conclusively links the monument to any single function. Attempts to identify its creators have proven equally inconclusive. Radiocarbon dating of nearby archaeological materials generally supports an association with the Paracas culture, although those dates come from surrounding contexts rather than from the geoglyph itself. Some researchers argue that later Nazca communities may have inherited or reused an already ancient monument, while others believe the figure could represent an independent tradition that influenced subsequent geoglyph construction farther south. The chronological overlap between the decline of Paracas society and the emergence of Nazca culture complicates every attempt to establish a clear historical sequence. Without organic material directly tied to the carving process, archaeology cannot yet determine exactly when the hillside was first transformed into its present form. Its unique appearance also separates it from nearly every other geoglyph in Peru. Nazca contains hundreds of geometric figures, animals, and straight lines spread across an immense desert plateau, creating an extensive ceremonial landscape. Paracas, by contrast, presents one overwhelmingly dominant image rather than an entire network of monumental drawings. If carving enormous geoglyphs formed a widespread cultural tradition in this region, archaeologists would expect to discover numerous comparable examples nearby. While satellite imagery, drone surveys, and field expeditions have identified additional ancient markings around Pisco, Palpa, and neighbouring valleys, none approaches the scale, preservation, or commanding visual impact of the candelabra. Its apparent isolation only deepens the uncertainty surrounding its original role. Modern technology has answered some questions while creating new ones. High-resolution photogrammetry, digital terrain modelling, and remote sensing have mapped the monument with centimetre-level precision, confirming that its proportions are more deliberate than many earlier observers assumed. Geological analyses demonstrate that the grooves penetrate stable sediment layers rather than simply scratching loose surface sand. Climate studies explain why extreme aridity contributes significantly to preservation. Yet every scientific advance seems to narrow only part of the mystery while exposing another. Archaeology can describe how the monument survives, estimate when it was probably created, and reconstruct the environment in which it was built. But it still cannot explain why ancient people invested enormous effort into carving a symbol whose meaning disappeared almost completely from history. Krishna's butterball rises above the granite landscape of Mahabalipuram on India's southeastern coast in Tamil Nadu, only a short distance from the UNESCO-listed Pallava monuments. European surveyors documented the remarkable boulder during the 19th century while recording the rock-cut temples scattered across the hill, but local communities had known it for centuries under traditions connected with the Hindu god Krishna. Unlike the surrounding shrines, however, this immense granite mass was never carved into architecture. It simply remained where it stood, balanced on a sloping bedrock surface so improbably that generations of archaeologists, geologists, engineers, and visitors have continued asking the same question. Why has it never fallen? The boulder measures roughly 6 meters high and 5 meters across, with most scientific estimates placing its weight between about 250 and 300 metric tons. At first glance, the contact area between the stone and the underlying rock appears astonishingly small, while the supporting slope inclines at approximately 40 to 45 degrees. Human intuition suggests that gravity should eventually overcome such an arrangement, yet geological evidence indicates the opposite. The rock has likely occupied this position for many thousands of years, surviving tropical monsoons, seasonal temperature fluctuations, repeated weathering, and countless cycles of erosion. It also remained unmoved after the devastating 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami, an event that dramatically reshaped sections of the nearby coastline and even revealed archaeological remains previously buried beneath coastal sediments. The survival of the boulder through such extreme natural forces has become one of the strongest reasons it continues to fascinate researchers. Modern geology explains much of this apparent paradox without removing every uncertainty. Krishna's butterball consists of ancient granite belonging to the Precambrian formations underlying the Coromandel coast. The rock itself is interpreted as a classic example of spheroidal weathering, a process in which fractures allow groundwater to penetrate granite over immense geological timescales. Chemical alteration gradually rounds exposed blocks, while surrounding material erodes away, eventually leaving isolated boulders that appear almost sculpted. Similar formations occur elsewhere around the world, but few display such an extraordinary balance. Detailed geological studies suggest that the visible contact area is misleading because the boulder's center of mass lies well within its supporting base, while microscopic irregularities along both rock surfaces generate far greater friction than observers expect. Even so, no field demonstration has fully reproduced why such a massive object appears so precariously perched while remaining remarkably stable. The explanation satisfies the equations of mechanics, yet continues to challenge ordinary visual perception, leaving the site suspended between scientific understanding and instinctive disbelief. That geological interpretation also raises a deeper archaeological question. Krishna's butterball stands within one of the greatest concentrations of early medieval rock-cut architecture in South Asia. During the 7th and 8th centuries, the Pallava dynasty transformed Mahabalipuram into a ceremonial landscape filled with monolithic temples, cave sanctuaries, enormous relief carvings, and unfinished monuments that demonstrate exceptional mastery of granite. Craftsmen removed thousands of tons of stone to create structures such as the Pancharathas and the celebrated Descent of the Ganges relief. If they possessed the knowledge and labour required to reshape entire hillsides, why was this enormous boulder deliberately left untouched? Archaeology has never produced a definitive answer. No inscription describes its purpose, no contemporary text explains its significance, and no surviving artwork identifies it as a sacred monument. Rather than being an obstacle, the stone appears to have been incorporated naturally into the surrounding sacred landscape, suggesting that its unusual appearance may already have carried symbolic importance before monumental construction began. Whether the Pallavas regarded it as a divine feature, a landmark, a ritual gathering point, or simply an untouchable element of the terrain remains unknown. The uncertainty becomes even greater because the familiar name Krishna's butterball is not ancient. It emerged much later through local folklore, comparing the rounded granite mass with the butter beloved by the child god Krishna in Hindu tradition. Archaeologists cannot demonstrate that the Pallava builders used this name or even associated the boulder with Krishna at all. The original identity of the stone has disappeared from the historical record. That missing cultural context creates one of archaeology's greatest limitations. Physical evidence can establish the age of monuments, identify construction techniques, and reconstruct ancient landscapes. But when written records are absent, the meanings attached to natural landmarks often vanish completely. The boulder therefore survives as an object whose physical existence is unquestionable, while its cultural significance remains almost entirely speculative. Colonial accounts added another layer to the mystery. According to widely repeated reports from the early 20th century, the governor of Madras, Arthur Lawley, considered the boulder potentially dangerous because of its apparent instability and ordered an attempt to remove it. Several elephants, commonly described as 7, were reportedly harnessed to pull the rock away from the slope. Despite their combined strength, the effort failed to shift the granite even slightly. Historians continue debating how accurately later retellings reflect the original event, and some details may have become embellished over time. Nevertheless, the persistence of the story reflects an important reality. Engineers expected the stone to move far more easily than it actually did, reinforcing the contrast between human expectation and the mechanical stability demonstrated by the boulder itself. Scientific investigations today increasingly rely on high-resolution topographic mapping structural geology and digital three-dimensional modeling to understand the relationship between the boulder and its bedrock foundation. Laser scanning can measure subtle variations across the contact surfaces with millimeter precision, while drone photogrammetry reconstructs the surrounding terrain in exceptional detail. These methods have strengthened the interpretation that the stone occupies a naturally stable equilibrium rather than an impossible one. Yet they cannot answer every archaeological question, because the most important uncertainties concern human decisions rather than geological processes. Researchers still cannot determine whether ancient people modified the supporting surface, whether small adjustments were made to stabilize the boulder before nearby monuments were constructed, or whether its placement influenced the overall planning of the sacred complex. Excavation beneath the contact area is effectively impossible without threatening the monument itself, leaving some hypotheses beyond direct testing. The unfinished monuments surrounding Krishna's butterball deepen the sense that Mahabalipuram preserves a landscape frozen in the middle of transformation. Across the granite hills are abandoned carving marks, incomplete shrines, and partially excavated sanctuaries whose construction suddenly ceased for reasons that remain debated. Political change within the Pallava kingdom, shifting religious priorities, economic pressures, or interruptions caused by warfare have all been proposed, yet no single explanation accounts for every unfinished structure. Against that backdrop, the untouched boulder appears less like an isolated curiosity and more like part of a broader archaeological puzzle concerning how natural rock formations and monumental architecture interacted within one evolving ceremonial landscape. Ishi no Hoden stands on the slope of Mount Hoden in Takasago, Hyogo Prefecture, Japan, enclosed within the grounds of Oshiko Shrine. It was already known when the Harima Provincial Gazetteer was compiled in the early 8th century, while the German physician Philipp Franz von Siebold later recorded it in detailed sketches published in 1832. Modern investigation began measuring rather than merely describing the monument, and between 2005 and 2006 researchers working with the Takasago City Board of Education and Oteme University produced a three-dimensional survey of its surfaces. What they documented was not a transported boulder, but an immense object carved directly from the living rock and left almost detached inside the quarry from which it emerged. The survey calculated a width of approximately 6.49 meters, a height of 5.71 meters, and a total depth of about 7.39 meters when the large projection on its rear is included. Its volume was estimated at 203.5 cubic meters. Using a density of 2.285 tons per cubic meter, researchers calculated a mass of roughly 465 tons, lower than the frequently repeated popular estimate of 500 or even 600 tons, but still extraordinary for a single worked block. The material is Tatsuyama stone, a volcanic tuff formed from pyroclastic deposits created approximately 100 million years ago. It was workable enough to become an important regional building stone, yet durable enough to survive in sarcophagi, temple foundations, castle walls, and monumental architecture for more than 16 centuries. Its geological setting removes one popular misconception, but deepens the archaeological problem. Ishi no Hoden was not hauled to the mountain by an unknown technology. Ancient workers selected a mass within the bedrock and excavated downward around it, leaving narrow passages along the sides and rear. They shaped the remaining stone into a vertical rectangular body with a smaller central section and a roof-like projection extending from one face. Most of the block was released from the surrounding rock, but a concealed stone connection beneath it remained attached to the floor. Water gathers inside the excavated basin and hides that support, producing the famous impression that the monument is floating. The effect explains its traditional name, the floating stone, without requiring any physical anomaly, but it does not explain why its makers designed the object to stand above a water-filled hollow in the first place. The central mystery is therefore not whether ancient people could carve stone. The surrounding Tatsuyama quarry complex contains abundant proof that communities in the region possessed an established stoneworking industry from the Kofun period onward. More than 100 quarry locations have been identified around Takasago, and Tatsuyama stone travelled far beyond the immediate landscape. Craftsmen cut it into sarcophagi during the Middle and Late Kofun period, while later builders used it for palace foundations and Buddhist architecture. Ishi no Hoden belongs to a landscape of skilled extraction rather than an isolated technological miracle, yet nothing else in that landscape matches its scale, form, or unfinished condition. The same evidence that demonstrates how it could have been carved also makes its unusual design harder to dismiss as ordinary quarrying. Its age remains uncertain because stone cannot normally be radiocarbon dated, and the monument preserves no inscription naming a ruler, patron, or workforce. The earliest surviving written reference appears in the Harima Fudoki, compiled around 713 to 717, proving that the stone existed by the early 8th century, but not revealing when work began. Archaeologists often place its creation in the late Kofun or Asuka period, particularly around the 6th or 7th century, because this was a time when monumental stone chambers, enormous sarcophagi, and increasingly ambitious state projects were being constructed in Western Japan. That estimate is based on historical and technological context, rather than a secure excavated layer directly associated with the carving. The monument could be older than the surviving record, but there is currently no scientific evidence supporting claims that it belongs to a remotely prehistoric or unknown civilization. Attempts to identify its function encounter an even greater absence of evidence. The block has been described as a tomb component, a monumental sarcophagus, the foundation of a stone building, a ritual object, or an abandoned architectural element. Its rear projection has sometimes been compared with the roof-like forms of certain ancient stone coffins, encouraging the theory that Ishi no Hoden was intended as an enormous funerary structure. Yet a sarcophagus normally requires a chamber or cavity for the deceased, and no confirmed burial space has been identified within the visible mass. Neither human remains nor funerary objects have established a mortuary purpose, while the surrounding basin does not resemble a completed tomb. Similarity of shape may indicate a shared architectural tradition, but it cannot by itself reveal what this object was supposed to become. The possibility of an unfinished monument appears stronger, because substantial parts retain the character of quarry work rather than final finishing. The lower attachment was never removed, the block was never transported, and no completed structure was built around it. Even so, the word unfinished only describes its condition. It does not explain the project. Workers had already removed a vast quantity of bedrock from the top, sides and rear, creating a confined space around an object weighing hundreds of tons. This was not an accidental fragment exposed after a few days of extraction. It represents extensive planning and coordinated labour carried far enough to define the monument's overall geometry. If the intention was to move it, the builders faced the problem of lowering, turning and transporting a mass far larger than most known Tatsuyama sarcophagi. If it was meant to remain where it stood, then the hidden support surrounding trench and collecting water may have been deliberate parts of the design rather than signs of abandonment. That uncertainty produces one of the monument's most important engineering questions. Quarry workers usually isolate stone in forms that can be removed efficiently, but Ishino-Hoden was shaped as a top-heavy mass inside a narrow excavation. Its rear projection increases the depth and complicates any hypothetical movement. Researchers can reconstruct the sequence by which channels were cut around the bedrock, yet the final operation remains unknown. The builders may have intended to separate the base and move the block, but no surviving ramp, hauling road, or prepared destination has been conclusively connected to it. Alternatively, they may have been carving a stationary sacred object, although no inscription or securely dated ritual deposit confirms that interpretation. The physical evidence allows both possibilities while proving neither. Questions also remain about the labour invested in the excavation. Popular accounts sometimes claim that thousands of tons of removed stone simply disappeared, but the mountain formed part of a long-used quarry district, so discarded or reusable material could have entered ordinary production over centuries. The missing spoil is not evidence of lost machinery. The more defensible mystery concerns the original work sequence. How many people participated, which faces were cut first, whether the surrounding space was intentionally narrow, and whether an unseen flaw in the stone forced the project to stop. Geological fractures, changes in political authority, the death of a patron or the collapse of a labour organisation could all have ended construction without leaving a written explanation. Since the carving surface itself cannot record those social events, archaeology must infer them from a monument stripped of its original context. The water beneath the stone presents another unresolved distinction between natural circumstance and intentional design. Rain and groundwater collect in the depression, concealing the central support and strengthening the illusion of suspension. Later religious tradition incorporated this appearance into the identity of the shrine, but it is uncertain whether the earliest builders anticipated a permanent pool. The basin may originally have been a working trench that filled after the monument was abandoned, or the builders may have designed the stone to rise symbolically above water. Without an ancient drainage system, datable sediment sequence, or associated ritual material, the modern appearance cannot automatically be projected backward to the moment of construction. Marcahuasi Stone Forest, rising almost 4,000 meters above sea level in Peru's Andes, presents one of archaeology's most stubborn unanswered questions. Across a granite plateau covering roughly 4 square kilometers, enormous stone formations appear to resemble human faces, animals, and monuments with such uncanny precision that researchers still cannot fully determine where natural geology ends and possible human intervention begins. The modern story of Marcahuasi began in the middle of the 20th century when Peruvian explorer Daniel Russo systematically documented the plateau after local shepherds had long known of its strange rocks. His surveys and photographs introduced the site to a wider scientific audience. But instead of settling the debate, they triggered decades of disagreement between archaeologists, geologists, and anthropologists. Field investigations confirmed that the plateau contains archaeological remains associated primarily with the Huanca culture and later Inca occupation. Yet, none of those discoveries explain the extraordinary granite formations dominating the landscape. More than 70 years after the first detailed surveys, the central mystery remains remarkably unchanged. Everything begins with the gigantic faces. Some rise more than 20 meters above the surrounding terrain, while the largest formations approach 30 meters in height. Unlike carved statues whose edges clearly preserve marks of chisels or hammerstones, these immense figures exist in an uncomfortable middle ground. Geologists argue that the plateau consists mainly of fractured granodiorite and granite, exposed to millions of years of weathering. Water entered natural joints, daily temperature changes widened microscopic cracks, and erosion gradually sculpted isolated pillars and rounded surfaces. Such processes are well understood throughout the Andes, yet they do not fully explain why several formations possess proportions resembling carefully designed human profiles viewed from remarkably specific angles. The most famous example is commonly called the Monument to Humanity. Standing before it at one position reveals what appears to be a monumental human face, but moving only a short distance or waiting until the late afternoon transforms the same rock into multiple completely different faces created solely by changing shadows. Researchers describe this as an interaction between complex three-dimensional geometry, solar illumination, and pareidolia, the neurological tendency of the human brain to recognize familiar patterns, especially faces, within random shapes. Pareidolia certainly explains why people perceive images inside clouds or mountain cliffs, yet Marcahuasi pushes that explanation to an unusual limit because the apparent sculptures are exceptionally large, unusually consistent, and concentrated within a relatively small plateau. Archaeology, therefore, faces a question that geology alone cannot completely answer. Were these formations left entirely untouched, or did ancient inhabitants subtly modify naturally weathered rock until they produced recognizable figures without leaving obvious tool marks? That uncertainty becomes even greater because the plateau contains far more than a single convincing formation. Visitors and researchers have identified rocks resembling condors, llamas, turtles, monkeys, lions, frogs, and numerous human heads. Individual interpretations differ, but the concentration itself remains remarkable. If every figure results entirely from coincidence, Marcahuasi represents one of the most extraordinary natural collections of recognizable rock forms anywhere in the Andes. If even a fraction were intentionally enhanced, the implications for understanding prehistoric landscape modification would be significant. Despite repeated examinations, archaeologists have never recovered convincing evidence of large-scale sculpting, while geologists likewise cannot demonstrate with certainty that every apparent figure developed without human influence. The debate therefore survives because neither discipline possesses evidence strong enough to eliminate the other's possibility. The archaeological remains scattered across the plateau deepen the mystery instead of resolving it. Stone terraces, stairways, retaining walls, leveled platforms, and ceremonial spaces indicate that ancient communities repeatedly occupied this high-altitude environment despite its harsh climate. At elevations approaching 4,000 meters, temperatures fluctuate dramatically between day and night. Oxygen levels are substantially lower than at sea level, and agriculture becomes increasingly difficult. Constructing ceremonial or residential spaces under such conditions required planning, labor, and long-term commitment. Excavations have associated much of this occupation with the Huanca people before the Inca incorporated the region into their expanding empire, yet no surviving tradition or written source attributes the remarkable stone faces to either culture. This absence of cultural attribution creates another unresolved archaeological problem. Ancient civilizations throughout Peru left unmistakable signatures in architecture, ceramics, textiles, and stone carving. At Marcahuasi, however, no quarrying debris, unfinished sculptures, discarded carving tools, or workshops corresponding to monumental rock modification have ever been identified. If prehistoric builders intentionally shaped the formations, they left almost no technological evidence behind. If they did not, then generations of Andean communities deliberately established ceremonial activity within a naturally occurring landscape already possessing astonishing visual characteristics. Either conclusion raises difficult questions that archaeology has not answered satisfactorily. Adding another layer of complexity is the peculiar relationship between movement, perspective, and perception across the plateau. Many formations reveal recognizable images only from carefully defined viewpoints. Walking a few meters in either direction often causes an apparently perfect face to dissolve into an ordinary weathered outcrop, while another hidden profile suddenly emerges elsewhere. Modern researchers studying visual cognition recognize this phenomenon as anamorphic perception, in which three-dimensional geometry produces dramatically different images depending upon the observer's position. The scientific explanation describes how the illusion works, but it does not determine whether ancient inhabitants intentionally recognized and perhaps enhanced these optical effects thousands of years ago. Without direct evidence of carving, archaeology cannot distinguish deliberate artistic planning from extraordinarily fortunate geology. Because of these unanswered questions, some investigators explored whether the plateau also possessed astronomical significance. Several prominent rock alignments appear to correspond approximately with sunrise or sunset during particular seasons, encouraging suggestions that Marcahuasi functioned partly as a ceremonial observation center. Such proposals remain controversial because statistically meaningful, astronomical alignments are difficult to establish without associated architectural planning or written records. Unlike confirmed Andean observatories where repeated geometric patterns strengthen astronomical interpretations, Marcahuasi has produced no consensus demonstrating that its dramatic landscape was intentionally organized around celestial events. The possibility remains open, but the available evidence remains insufficient. Scientific studies increasingly emphasize geology, geomorphology, and landscape archaeology, rather than sensational explanations. Remote sensing, detailed topographic mapping, drone photography, and digital terrain modeling have improved understanding of fracture networks across the plateau, showing how natural weathering exploited structural weaknesses within the granite over immense spans of geological time. Those findings strongly support a natural origin for the rock masses themselves. Yet even the most sophisticated three-dimensional models cannot answer whether prehistoric communities selectively modified existing formations, whose shapes already suggested recognizable figures. That narrow but crucial distinction continues to separate competing interpretations. Zorat Kara, also known as Karahunj, rises across the volcanic plateau of Syunik province in southern Armenia, where more than 200 massive stones have stood against the wind for thousands of years. Few prehistoric monuments have generated such radically different interpretations. Depending on which evidence is emphasized, this silent circle could represent the world's oldest astronomical observatory, a Bronze Age ritual sanctuary, an elite cemetery, or several completely different monuments merged into one over centuries of reuse. After decades of archaeological work, none of these explanations has been able to account for every feature preserved on the site. Modern attention began in the 19th century when Russian and Armenian scholars documented the unusual stone arrangement during surveys of the region, but systematic archaeological excavations only expanded during the second half of the 20th century. The monument occupies an area of roughly 7 hectares at an elevation of about 1,770 meters above sea level. Around 223 basalt megaliths survive, many standing between 1 and 3 meters high and weighing several tons. What immediately separates Karahunj from countless other stone circles is that approximately 80 of these monoliths contain carefully drilled circular holes, each measuring roughly 4 to 5 centimeters in diameter and extending as much as 60 centimeters through exceptionally hard volcanic basalt. Those openings transformed an already remarkable monument into one of archaeology's most enduring puzzles. The greatest mystery remains whether Karahunj was intentionally designed as an astronomical observatory thousands of years before Stonehenge. This theory became internationally known through Armenian physicist Paris Harouni, who argued that the perforated stones functioned as fixed sighting tubes aimed towards specific celestial targets. After surveying the monument, he proposed that several alignments corresponded with the rising or setting positions of the sun during the summer and winter solstices, while others appeared to point toward prominent stars including Sirius, Deneb, and Vega. Harouni went even further, suggesting that parts of the monument could date to approximately 5,500 BC, making it nearly 3 millennia older than the earliest construction phases at Stonehenge. If that interpretation proved correct, the history of prehistoric astronomy would require substantial revision, because one of humanity's earliest known observatories would not be located in Britain or Mesopotamia, but high in the Armenian highlands. Yet the evidence has never produced consensus. Archaeologists specializing in prehistoric monuments have challenged nearly every aspect of the astronomical model. Several researchers argue that statistical analysis allows enough possible sightlines among more than 200 stones to produce apparent celestial alignments by coincidence. Others point out that there is no definitive proof every standing stone remains in its original position after thousands of years of earthquakes, erosion, and human activity. Even a small shift of several degrees would invalidate many astronomical calculations. Despite these criticisms, no alternative explanation has demonstrated conclusively that every proposed alignment is accidental. The debate therefore remains unusually balanced, with neither side possessing evidence strong enough to close the discussion. The drilled holes themselves deepen the mystery because archaeology has yet to identify another prehistoric monument displaying this combination of scale, precision, and consistency. Producing dozens of nearly cylindrical perforations through dense basalt would have demanded considerable labor using Bronze Age technology, yet no convincing explanation exists for why such an enormous investment was necessary. If the openings served as observation tubes, their dimensions could have reduced peripheral light and improved viewing precision towards selected points on the horizon. If they supported wooden beams, ropes, or ritual structures, no surviving archaeological traces confirm that arrangement. Another hypothesis proposes that powerful mountain winds passing through their holes generated whistling sounds during certain weather conditions, perhaps creating an acoustic component within ceremonial gatherings. Local traditions describing the monument as singing stones have encouraged that idea, although controlled archaeological evidence remains insufficient to establish whether the sound was intentional or merely an incidental effect of the landscape. The location itself raises another unresolved question. Karhunj occupies an exposed plateau where winters are severe, strong winds are constant, and large populations were unlikely to concentrate permanently. Transporting hundreds of basalt blocks, several weighing multiple tons, onto this elevated terrain would have required remarkable organization regardless of the builder's identity. Archaeologists have not identified an undisputed quarry directly associated with the monument, nor have they reconstructed the engineering methods used to extract, transport, and erect the stones. Unlike Egyptian monuments where unfinished blocks, quarry marks, and transport ramps occasionally survive, Karahunj preserves almost no direct evidence explaining how construction was accomplished. The engineering effort can therefore be estimated only indirectly from the finished monument itself. Radiocarbon dating has complicated rather than simplified the chronology. Excavations around several burial structures have produced dates generally consistent with the Middle Bronze Age, approximately the early 2nd millennium BC, while other researchers argue that portions of the monument may incorporate much older elements reused by later societies. Instead of representing a single construction episode, Karahunj increasingly appears to have accumulated over many centuries, with successive communities modifying an already ancient, sacred landscape. Such a scenario would explain why archaeological evidence sometimes points toward different periods without necessarily disproving earlier activity. Unfortunately, it also makes determining the monument's original purpose far more difficult because later alterations may have obscured the earliest design. Its overall layout refuses to fit neatly within any familiar prehistoric category. The central stone circle connects to long linear avenues extending across the plateau before reaching additional standing stones and nearby burial features. Some researchers interpret the arrangement as a ceremonial processional complex, while others compare the geometry with symbolic representations of constellations or celestial pathways. A funerary interpretation also appears plausible because stone cists and tombs occupy the surrounding landscape. The problem is that none of these models successfully explains every architectural element simultaneously. If the monuments serve primarily as a cemetery, the carefully drilled holes remain unnecessary. If astronomy was its principal function, the associated burials require further explanation. If ritual processions define the site, the astronomical alignments become difficult to dismiss entirely. Every hypothesis solves one part of the puzzle while leaving another unresolved. The uncertainty extends beyond interpretation to the monument's physical history. Geological processes, seismic activity, and centuries of human intervention may have altered the positions of individual stones. Some researchers believe several monoliths were re-erected after collapsing, while others suspect earlier restoration attempts unintentionally changed original orientations. Because no ancient plans or written descriptions survive, reconstructing the initial configuration with complete confidence is impossible. This uncertainty directly affects astronomical studies, since even slight positional changes could transform accurate alignments into meaningless coincidences or obscure genuine ones that once existed. Advances in archaeological technology have added valuable data without resolving the central questions. High-resolution topographic mapping, satellite imagery, three-dimensional modeling, and renewed field surveys continue documenting every stone with increasing precision, yet improved measurements alone cannot reveal intentions left unrecorded by prehistoric builders. Archaeology excels at reconstructing material evidence, but Karahunj illustrates its greatest limitation. Artifacts can demonstrate what survives, while purpose often remains hidden when written records never existed. Every new survey sharpens the monument's physical description, but the motivations behind its construction remain beyond direct observation. Osirion, Abydos, Egypt. Behind the decorated Temple of Seti lies a sunken monument whose age, design, and original purpose remain subjects of debate more than a century after its excavation. The structure emerged during excavations at Abydos in 1902 and 1903, when Margaret Murray, Hilda Petrie, and Flinders Petrie investigated ground behind the temple. Instead of another decorated chapel, they encountered passages descending toward a building buried far below the surrounding surface. Later clearance by Edouard Naville and Henri Frankfurt exposed a monumental central hall built from enormous blocks of red granite, sandstone, and limestone. Frankfurt's detailed report, published in 1933, identified it as the cenotaph of Seti I, yet its appearance was so unlike the temple beside it that questions concerning its history began almost immediately. The deepest uncertainty concerns whether the Osirion was constructed together with Seti I's temple during the 13th century BCE, or whether the pharaoh incorporated an older sacred structure into his complex. Its floor lies roughly 8 meters below the level of the neighboring temple, creating the impression that the building belongs to a landscape that had already been buried before Seti's architects arrived. Its central chamber also rejects the visual language of the temple above. Seti's sanctuary is covered with finely carved reliefs, painted figures, hieroglyphic texts, and rows of carefully organized rooms. The Osirion is dominated instead by massive undecorated masonry, heavy granite pillars, broad stone lintels, and a severe geometry resembling some monuments of the Old Kingdom more than 1,000 years earlier. That contrast produced the enduring claim that the Osirion may predate Seti West. The idea is visually persuasive, but archaeological evidence makes the problem more complicated. Inscriptions, construction marks, and repeated royal names connect the monument directly with Seti. One ancient name recorded for the structure can be translated approximately as Setith is beneficial to Osiris, while cartouches and religious texts appear in chambers belonging to the complex. Egyptologist Peter Brand therefore argued that the monument can be dated confidently to Seti's reign. Its position also follows the central axis of the temple so precisely that accidental alignment is extremely unlikely. These details support a unified building program rather than the later discovery of an unrelated ruin. Yet those arguments do not explain why Seti's builders created a monument that deliberately looked archaic, placed it so far below the temple, and surrounded its central platform with channels that evoked an island rising from water. If it was not genuinely ancient when Seti found it, then it was designed to appear ancient. This may have been intentional theology rather than evidence of a forgotten civilization. Abydos was one of Egypt's most sacred places, closely associated with Osiris, death, regeneration, and the origins of kingship. By constructing a subterranean stone chamber in a style recalling Egypt's remote past, Seti may have been manufacturing sacred antiquity, giving his monument the authority of a primordial structure even when it was newly built. The engineering required to create that effect remains extraordinary. The central hall contains 10 massive red granite supports arranged around a raised rectangular island. Heavy granite architraves once crossed above them, while surrounding walls and chambers were constructed from large blocks of sandstone and limestone. The granite had to be quarried in the Aswan region, hundreds of kilometers south of Abydos, transported north along the Nile, moved inland, and lowered into a deep excavation. Archaeologists understand the general technologies available to Egyptian builders: stone sledges, timber, ropes, prepared ramps, river barges, pounding stones, copper tools, and abrasive quartz sand. What cannot be reconstructed with certainty is the exact sequence used at this particular site, because no building ramp, transport record, engineering plan, or complete construction yard has survived. The depth of the monument intensified every stage of the operation. Builders were not simply placing heavy columns on an open foundation. They had to excavate a huge pit, stabilize its sides, prepare a level base, deliver stone into the depression, position the supports, raise the lintels, construct surrounding walls, and finally cover much of the building beneath an artificial mound. Frankfurt concluded that the Osirion was originally subterranean, with only its mound and perhaps limited architectural features visible above ground. Its present open appearance is deceptive because much of the roof has disappeared. The monument seen today is therefore the exposed skeleton of a structure once intended to feel enclosed, dark, and separated from the ordinary world. Water adds another unresolved dimension. The central island is bordered by deep channels, and groundwater now occupies much of the lower structure. Modern geophysical research around the site has identified buried geological pathways capable of carrying groundwater from the direction of the Nile, helping explain why flooding continues. this does not prove that the present water level existed when the monument was built, but water was almost certainly part of the intended symbolism. In Egyptian cosmology, the first land emerged from none, the limitless primeval waters that existed before creation. The Osirion's raised island may have represented this first mound, while the deceased king identified with Osiris participated in a cycle of burial, regeneration, and cosmic renewal. Even so, archaeologists still debate how literally the water system should be interpreted. The channels may have been deliberately filled during ceremonies, supplied by groundwater, connected to a basin, or left mostly dry while functioning as an architectural image of the primeval ocean. No intact hydraulic installation has been recovered that explains precisely how water entered, circulated, and left the monument during the New Kingdom. Today's flooding also limits access, conceals lower masonry, deposits sediment, and makes it difficult to separate ancient water management from later geological change. The feature that gives the Osirion its strongest symbolic meaning is therefore also one of the greatest obstacles to understanding its original operation. Its function is equally difficult to define. The monument is commonly called a cenotaph of Seti Wurst, meaning a symbolic tomb rather than the place where his body was buried. Seti's actual tomb, KV-17, was cut into the Valley of the Kings at Thebes, more than 100 kilometers away. At Abydos, the king may have created a second sacred burial landscape in which he could be ritually united with Osiris. The texts preserved in the Osirion include complex cosmographic compositions concerned with the underworld, the sun's nocturnal journey, creation, death, and rebirth. Some appear among the earlier surviving examples of religious material later developed in royal tombs, showing that the monument was not an empty mass of stone but an experimental centre of funerary theology. However, calling it a cenotaph does not fully explain what occurred inside. Archaeologists cannot identify the complete sequence of ceremonies, determine who was permitted to enter, establish whether a symbolic body or statue occupied the central island, or prove how frequently rituals were performed. The building may have served simultaneously as a memorial to Seti, a tomb of Osiris, a stage for regeneration rites, and a monumental model of creation. Modern categories such as temple, tomb, and cenotaph may be too narrow for a structure designed to combine several sacred realities within a single subterranean space. Plain of Jars, Jianghuang Plateau, Laos. More than 2,000 enormous stone jars stand across rolling hills where no ancient city survives. No inscriptions identify their builders, and no accepted explanation can fully account for why they were created. More than 100 archaeological sites scattered across the plateau preserve one of Southeast Asia's greatest prehistoric enigmas, a landscape that continues to challenge archaeology despite decades of excavation and increasingly sophisticated scientific analysis. The outside world first learned of the jars in the late 19th century when French explorer and architect Louis Delaporte described them during expedition through Laos. But systematic archaeological investigation did not begin until the French archaeologist Madeleine Colani surveyed the plateau during the 1930s. She documented hundreds of massive jars, mapped their distribution, excavated nearby burials, and proposed that the vessels played a role in prehistoric funerary rituals. Nearly a century later, research teams from Laos, Australia, Japan, New Zealand, Europe, and the United States have added radiocarbon dating, optically stimulated luminescence, drone mapping, isotopic analysis, and three-dimensional geological surveys to the investigation, yet the central mystery remains remarkably resistant to a definitive answer. The sheer scale of the monument is the first puzzle. More than 2,000 surviving jars have been recorded across over 100 separate locations, although archaeologists believe many more remain hidden beneath vegetation or unexplored terrain. Individual jars range from roughly 1 meter to more than 3 meters in height, while the heaviest examples are estimated to weigh over 30 metric tons. Most were carved from sandstone, though granite, limestone, conglomerate, and breccia also appear throughout the complex. Every vessel began as a single block of stone, its interior painstakingly hollowed out with iron tools, leaving walls that often maintain surprisingly consistent thickness despite their enormous dimensions. Producing a single jar would have required thousands of hours of labour, but creating thousands of them represents an investment of time and resources unlike anything else known in prehistoric mainland Southeast Asia. The greatest mystery has always been the purpose of these giant vessels. Their appearance naturally suggests storage, yet almost every scientific investigation has complicated that seemingly simple interpretation. Kalani believed the jars formed part of an elaborate mortuary tradition in which bodies were temporarily placed inside until decomposition was complete, before bones were ceremonially buried nearby. The idea gained support because excavations uncovered cremated remains, human skeletons, ceramic vessels, glass beads, iron objects, spindle whorls, bronze ornaments, and carved stone markers surrounding many jars. However, an unexpected contradiction gradually emerged. The overwhelming majority of human remains were discovered beside the jars rather than inside them. Only a handful of jars produced evidence that could even tentatively indicate human use within the stone containers themselves, and none has conclusively demonstrated that every jar functioned as a burial chamber. If these monuments truly served as prehistoric coffins, why do the dead consistently lie outside instead of inside them? That contradiction has inspired alternative theories, yet each raises equally difficult questions. Some researchers have suggested the jars stored rainwater for caravans, crossing the ancient trade routes linking present-day Laos, Vietnam, Thailand, and southern China. The Xianghuang Plateau occupies an elevated landscape where seasonal water availability could have been crucial for long-distance travel. Nevertheless, no mineral deposits consistent with prolonged water storage have been identified inside most jars, and carving thousands of multi-ton stone containers simply to collect rain appears unnecessarily labour-intensive. Others argue they functioned as fermentation vessels for rice wine used during large ceremonial gatherings, but direct chemical evidence supporting extensive brewing has yet to emerge. Ritual interpretation therefore remains the leading explanation, although even that broad category fails to clarify precisely what ceremonies required monuments of such extraordinary scale. As archaeologists continued examining the surrounding landscape, another mystery quietly became even more difficult to explain. Modern geological surveys have successfully identified several quarry sites where unfinished jars remain attached to bedrock, preserving abandoned stages of production. Tool marks carved into the stone confirm that prehistoric workers shaped many jars near their source before transporting them across the plateau. Some quarries lie several kilometers from their final destinations, while others are separated by rugged slopes, dense forest, seasonal streams, and uneven terrain. Moving objects weighing between 10 and 30 tons across such landscapes would challenge even modern equipment. Yet no preserved transport roads, wooden trackways, ramps, or mechanical systems have ever been identified. Experimental archaeology demonstrates that large stones can be moved using ropes, timber rollers, sledges, and coordinated labour. But none of these reconstructions fully accounts for the number of jars, the distances involved, or the difficult topography surrounding many sites. The engineering solution employed by the prehistoric builders therefore remains largely hypothetical. Even the placement of the jars appears deliberate in ways that archaeology has not yet decoded. They're rarely scattered randomly across the landscape. Instead, they occur in carefully defined clusters ranging from a handful of vessels to several hundred occupying elevated ridges, hilltops, or gently sloping ground with commanding views of surrounding valleys. Some stand alone while others form loose groups with irregular spacing and no obvious geometric pattern. Researchers have searched for consistent astronomical alignments, standardized orientations, or mathematical layouts, yet none explains every site. Geographic information system analysis indicates that many jar fields occupy visually prominent locations overlooking ancient movement corridors, but whether these positions marked sacred landscapes, territorial boundaries, ceremonial gathering places, or something entirely different remains uncertain. Dating the complex has answered some questions while creating others. Radiocarbon analysis of associated burials and optically stimulated luminescence dating of sediments indicate that many jars were probably quarried and positioned between approximately the late 2nd millennium and the early 1st millennium before the Common Era, with surrounding burial activity continuing well into the 1st millennium of the Common Era. This timeline suggests the monuments remained significant for many centuries, perhaps even longer than the culture responsible for their original construction. Such continuity raises an intriguing possibility that later communities inherited monuments whose original meaning had already begun to fade, adapting them into new ritual traditions while preserving only fragments of their original significance. The stone discs scattered throughout the plateau deepen that uncertainty. Numerous circular slabs have been discovered near the jars, some decorated with concentric rings, stylized human figures, or animal carvings. Early researchers assumed they served as lids, yet many were found buried face downward, or positioned far from any jar they could realistically cover. Their sizes also vary considerably, and many do not match nearby jar openings. Rather than solving the mystery, the discs introduce another unanswered question concerning whether they functioned as grave markers, ceremonial platforms, symbolic monuments, or architectural elements belonging to a broader ritual landscape that has otherwise disappeared. Scientific analysis of the stone itself has revealed another unexpected complexity. Petrographic examination demonstrates that the jars were not carved from a single preferred material, but from multiple rock types collected across different geological formations. Sandstone dominates many sites because it is easier to shape, yet granite, limestone, conglomerate, and breccia were also deliberately selected, despite requiring different quarrying techniques. This variation suggests the builders possessed detailed knowledge of local geology and intentionally exploited multiple quarries rather than relying upon one convenient source. Whether these choices reflected practical availability, cultural symbolism, or regional traditions remains impossible to determine from the surviving evidence. The absence of written records may be the greatest obstacle of all. Unlike Egypt, Mesopotamia, or Imperial China, no inscriptions identify the builders, commemorate rulers, describe rituals, or explain construction methods. Archaeologists therefore reconstruct the site's history almost entirely from physical evidence preserved beneath the soil. Every new excavation provides valuable data, yet each discovery seems to widen the gap between what can be measured scientifically and what can actually be understood about the beliefs of the people who created this extraordinary landscape. Cocknoe Stone lies beside the modern community of Faifley in western Bartonshire, Scotland, yet the symbols covering its surface belong to a world that disappeared roughly 5,000 years ago. The monument entered archaeological records in 1887, when Reverend James Harvey examined and illustrated a group of previously undescribed carved rocks near Duntosha. The largest panel later became known as the Kochno stone, although it is also recorded as White Hill 1. What Harvey documented was not a standing monument assembled from transported blocks, but a broad exposure of natural sandstone that prehistoric communities had transformed into one of Britain's most extensive concentrations of rock art. The carved surface measures approximately 13 metres by 8 metres and extends across nearly 100 square metres. More than 100 cut marks are distributed over the outcrop, accompanied by at least 45 recognisable cup and ring figures, multiple concentric rings, radial grooves, channels, spirals, and several less easily classified forms. Archaeologists generally place the carvings within the late Neolithic or early Bronze Age, broadly between 3000 and 2000 BCE, although no inscription, organic material, or securely associated occupation layer provides a direct date for the moment when the designs were cut. Their age is therefore inferred mainly by comparing them with similar rock art found elsewhere in Britain and Atlantic Europe. That uncertainty immediately leads to the question that has resisted every attempt at explanation. Who organised this enormous design, and what was it intended to represent? Seen individually, a shallow cup surrounded by one or more rings appears simple. Seen across the entire panel, however, the motifs form a dense visual field in which circles, grooves, and natural cracks repeatedly intersect. Some carvings stand alone, while others appear connected by channels that run between them or continue downslope. The result resembles neither a recognizable picture nor random decoration. It looks structured, but the rules governing that structure remain unknown. This is why Kochno stone is repeatedly described as a possible prehistoric map. Circular motifs could theoretically represent settlements, prominent hills, water sources, sacred places or territories, while the connecting grooves might indicate rivers, paths or relationships between locations. The scale of the panel would have allowed several people to gather around it, point to separate areas and follow routes across its surface. If information was communicated through the carvings, the stone may have functioned as a fixed diagram embedded directly within the landscape it described. Yet archaeology has never demonstrated that the design corresponds to any real geography. No accepted reconstruction has matched its circles and channels with the surrounding hills, streams, or ancient settlement pattern. The local terrain has also changed through erosion, farming, drainage, quarrying, and modern construction, making exact comparisons difficult. More importantly, the map interpretation depends upon a modern expectation that circles represent places and lines represent routes. The prehistoric makers may have understood the same forms in an entirely different way. A groove that resembles a river to a modern observer might instead have directed rainwater, connected ritual symbols, or recorded a relationship that was social rather than geographical. The panel's natural surface complicates the problem further. Kochno stone is not a flat tablet designed before the images were added. It is an irregular outcrop containing slopes, fissures, ridges, and weathered hollows. Some carved channels appear to exploit these existing features, suggesting that the makers were responding to the stone rather than simply using it as an empty surface. Water falling on the outcrop would have collected in cups, spilled across rings, and travelled through both artificial grooves and natural cracks. This has encouraged interpretations involving water, offerings, or repeated ceremonies, although no surviving evidence reveals whether liquid was deliberately poured across the carvings. The possibility that the stone represents the sky is equally difficult to prove. Concentric rings can evoke the sun, moon, stars, or cycles of celestial movement, and the panel's many linked forms have sometimes been treated as an astronomical scheme. In the 20th century, archaeologist Ludovic Mann developed an elaborate interpretation, connecting the symbols with eclipses and prehistoric cosmology. His reading was imaginative, but it depended upon speculative correspondences rather than a pattern that could be independently tested. Modern researchers have not identified a convincing match between the complete panel and a known arrangement of stars, lunar cycles, or solar observations. Orientation alone cannot solve the question. A monument built to mark sunrise or sunset can sometimes be tested against the horizon, but Kochno's stone contains dozens of motifs pointing in different directions. Selecting only a few apparently significant alignments risks ignoring the rest. With so many circles, grooves, and radiating lines, accidental correspondences become statistically likely. Unless a consistent astronomical system explains a substantial proportion of the carvings, the idea remains possible but unverified. The designs may instead preserve a symbolic language that did not operate like writing. Cup and ring marks occur across Scotland, northern England, Ireland, and other parts of Atlantic Europe, showing that the tradition was not unique to one settlement. Similar motifs were repeated over wide areas for generations, implying shared ideas or practices. Nevertheless, repetition does not reveal meaning. The same symbol might have referred to ancestry, territory, water, celestial cycles, social identity, or several concepts at once. Without readable inscriptions or an uninterrupted cultural tradition explaining the imagery, archaeologists cannot translate the marks into specific statements. Even the identity of the makers remains broad. Archaeology can place them within farming communities of the late Neolithic or early Bronze Age, but Kochno's stone has produced no names, rulers, or documented ceremonies. The panel may not have been created during a single coordinated event. Differences in depth, form, and weathering raise the possibility that groups returned repeatedly, adding new cups and rings beside older ones. If so, what now appears to be one immense composition may actually record centuries of activity, with each generation altering a surface whose original meaning was already changing. This possibility weakens the search for one master plan. The apparent map may be a layered accumulation rather than a diagram conceived by one designer. Older motifs could have guided the placement of later carvings, while natural damage and modern interference may have erased connections that once made the arrangement more intelligible. Archaeologists therefore face a monument whose final appearance may combine separate periods, different intentions, and later modifications on the same piece of rock. The amount of labour involved also remains difficult to interpret. The carvings were produced without iron tools, probably through repeated pecking and grinding with harder stone implements. Individual cups could be made gradually, but the complete panel represents a considerable investment of time. That effort suggests the location mattered deeply, yet excavations have not transformed Kochno stone into an obvious settlement, workshop, or conventional tomb. Its importance appears to have been expressed through the act of carving and revisiting the rock itself. The surrounding landscape strengthens this interpretation. Kochno stone is not isolated. It forms part of a wider concentration of rock art sites around Faifley. Smaller carved outcrops indicate that marking stone was a repeated regional practice, rather than an inexplicable event limited to one surface. Kochno may have been the largest focus within a network of meaningful places, perhaps visited during movement between settlements, grazing areas, or gathering points. However, the survival of several related panels still does not explain why this particular outcrop received such an exceptional density of symbols. Later human activity introduced another layer of confusion. During the 1930s, Ludovic Mann painted many carvings to make them visible and added geometric grids to the surface as part of his interpretation. Historic photographs show that the panel became not only a prehistoric artifact, but also a stage for modern theories. Paint, chalk, graffiti, and repeated exposure altered how later observers perceived the original design. Some lines that appear dramatic in older images were emphasized by modern coloring, making it essential to distinguish prehistoric grooves from 20th century additions. By the 1960s, vandalism and weathering had become serious concerns. In 1965, the entire outcrop was covered with soil to protect the relatively soft sandstone. The solution preserved the carvings but concealed one of Scotland's most important rock art panels for approximately half a century. It was briefly investigated in 2015 and then fully uncovered for several weeks in 2016 by a team involving the University of Glasgow and specialists in digital recording, photogrammetry, three-dimensional scanning and detailed photography produced a far more accurate record before the stone was buried again. Beda Valley, hidden inside the rugged mountains of central Sulawesi, Indonesia, preserves one of the strangest archaeological landscapes on Earth, where hundreds of massive stone figures stand in silence, despite the complete disappearance of the civilization that created them. The outside world knew almost nothing about the valley until Dutch explorer and botanist Eduard Cornelis Abendenon documented its remarkable stone monuments during an expedition through central Sulawesi in 1909. Since then, archaeologists have returned repeatedly, mapping the scattered sculptures, excavating nearby deposits, and applying radiocarbon dating to charcoal and organic material recovered around several monuments. Even after more than a century of investigation, the discoveries have answered surprisingly few questions. Instead, every excavation has reinforced a deeper mystery, because the monuments remain while the people responsible have almost entirely vanished from the archaeological record. Today, more than 400 megalithic remains have been documented across the neighbouring valleys of Bada, Besoa, and Napu, inside Lor Lindu National Park, with Bada containing the greatest concentration of large anthropomorphic statues. Some stand nearly 4 meters tall, while others are accompanied by enormous stone vats known locally as kalamba, carved from single blocks of granite weighing several tons. Unlike famous megalithic landscapes elsewhere in the world, there are no monumental temples, no surviving palaces, no inscriptions, and no written history explaining who these people were or why they transformed such an isolated valley into an immense ceremonial landscape. The absence of context has become the defining characteristic of Bada Valley itself. The greatest mystery begins with the craters. Archaeologists cannot confidently identify the society responsible for these monuments because almost every clue that normally connects a civilization to its architecture is missing. No historical kingdom in Sulawesi recorded their construction, no oral tradition can be reliably traced back to the builders, and no ancient script has ever been found on the statues or surrounding stones. Excavations have revealed traces of occupation in the region, but nothing resembling the dense settlements expected from a society capable of organizing large-scale stone carving projects over an extended period. This disconnect has left researchers debating whether the builders represented a forgotten local culture, a population that disappeared through migration or disease, or a regional civilization whose wooden settlements decayed completely in the tropical environment, while only the stone monuments survived. Dating the monuments has proven equally frustrating. Granite itself cannot be radiocarbon dated, forcing archaeologists to estimate the age indirectly by analysing charcoal, sediments, and organic remains recovered near the statues. The resulting dates span an enormous range, with different studies suggesting activity anywhere between roughly 500 years before the Common Era and the 15th century. Such a gap covers nearly 2,000 years, making it impossible to determine whether the monuments belong to a single culture, multiple generations of builders, or entirely separate phases of occupation. Unlike sites where inscriptions or historical records anchor archaeological chronologies, Barda Valley exists within one of the widest dating uncertainties found at any major megalithic complex in Southeast Asia. As researchers attempted to understand the chronology, attention shifted toward the statues themselves, whose appearance differs dramatically from nearly every other known megalithic tradition. The figures possess disproportionately large heads, perfectly circular eyes, elongated noses carved from a continuous ridge of stone, almost invisible mouths, and remarkably simplified bodies with little anatomical detail. Many appear expressionless, yet each carries subtle differences that suggest individual identities rather than repeated artistic formulas. Some clearly display male anatomy, others female characteristics, while several seem impossible to classify at all. None carry inscriptions identifying rulers, priests, or ancestors, leaving archaeologists unable to determine whether these sculptures portray real individuals, supernatural beings, clan founders, or symbolic representations whose meanings disappeared centuries ago. Equally remarkable is the realization that no two major statues are exactly alike. Their proportions, facial structures, body posture, and carved details vary enough to suggest deliberate personalization instead of standardized production. If each monument represents a specific person, no evidence survives explaining why these individuals were honored. If they instead depict gods or mythical beings, no associated mythology remains. The statues preserve recognizable faces, but have lost the identities behind them, creating one of archaeology's rare situations in which portraits outlive every memory of those portrayed. The engineering challenge only deepens the puzzle. Most statues in Calamba were carved from granite unavailable at many of their present locations, implying transportation over difficult terrain consisting of steep slopes, rivers, dense rainforest, and unstable volcanic soils. Several monuments weigh many tons, yet archaeologists have never identified ancient quarry complexes, prepared transport roads, sled tracks, or construction ramps comparable to those documented at other megalithic sites. Even with modern machinery, moving blocks of similar size across central Sulawesi would demand careful logistical planning. The complete absence of supporting infrastructure raises difficult questions about the organizational capacity of the builders and the methods they employed to reshape the landscape. Beside many statues stand the enormous Calamba, among the most distinctive stone containers found anywhere in Indonesia. These cylindrical vessels, often exceeding 2 meters in diameter, were hollowed from single granite blocks and frequently sealed with equally massive stone lids. Their scale immediately suggested a ceremonial purpose, yet decades of excavation have produced contradictory evidence. A small number contained fragmentary human remains or associated burial material, encouraging the interpretation that they functioned as communal funerary containers. Many others, however, were completely empty, with no skeletal material, grave goods, or residue capable of confirming their original use. Alternative explanations propose that they served as ritual water basins, secondary burial chambers, ceremonial fermentation vessels, or sacred containers reserved for practices now impossible to reconstruct. Every hypothesis explains part of the evidence while leaving equally significant contradictions unresolved. Surprisingly, the monuments occupy a landscape almost devoid of the urban remains expected from a culture capable of producing them. Archaeologists have uncovered scattered habitation traces and agricultural evidence, yet no settlement approaching the scale necessary to support hundreds of monumental stone projects has emerged. In many ancient societies, monumental architecture stands beside administrative centers, defensive walls, temples, or cemeteries. Barda Valley breaks this pattern. The monuments dominate the landscape while the society itself remains almost invisible, leading some researchers to suspect that most domestic architecture was built entirely from perishable materials such as wood and bamboo, which deteriorated rapidly in Sulawesi's humid tropical climate. The arrangement of the monuments presents another unresolved problem. Rather than forming orderly ceremonial avenues or astronomically aligned circles, many statues appear isolated or distributed irregularly across the valley floor. Some face different directions, others stand near rivers, while several occupy elevated terraces with no immediately obvious relationship to neighbouring monuments. Modern mapping using satellite imagery, drone surveys, and geographic information systems has revealed clusters, but no universally accepted organising principle. Whether the statues originally belonged to a coherent ceremonial design later disrupted by earthquakes, erosion and landslides, or whether they were intentionally erected across generations without a single master plan, remains uncertain. Geology may have erased part of the answer. Central Sulawesi lies within one of Indonesia's most tectonically active regions, where intersecting fault systems generate frequent earthquakes capable of transforming entire landscapes. Major seismic events, combined with landslides, flooding, and centuries of tropical weathering, could have destroyed wooden settlements while leaving the granite monuments standing. This scenario explains why the statues survived when nearly everything else disappeared, yet direct archaeological evidence connecting specific earthquakes to the abandonment of the valley has never been established. Rising above the Rhodope Mountains of southern Bulgaria near the modern town of Asenovgrad is a massive stone plateau more than 1,200 meters above sea level. From the air, it looks almost unnatural. A giant slab of exposed granite carved with channels, pits, basins, geometric cuts, and strange depressions that seem too deliberate to be random geology. The site is known as Belintash Plateau, and for decades it has remained one of the least understood ancient sites in Eastern Europe. Unlike famous megalithic locations such as Stonehenge or Machu Picchu, Belintash receives little international attention. Yet many archaeologists and geologists agree that some of its features are extremely difficult to explain using conventional Bronze Age technology. The discovery of Belintash as a serious archaeological site began relatively late. Although local legends about the plateau existed for centuries, systematic studies only intensified during the 20th century when Bulgarian archaeologists noticed unusual patterns carved directly into the granite surface. Excavations revealed ceramic fragments, ritual remains, and evidence connected to the ancient Thracians, a civilization that occupied large parts of the Balkans more than 3,000 years ago. But the deeper researchers looked, the stranger the plateau became. The first major mystery is the stone processing itself. Belintash is composed primarily of granite, one of the hardest natural construction materials commonly encountered by ancient civilizations. Granite measures around 6 to 7 on the Mohs hardness scale, meaning it is harder than bronze and difficult even for iron tools to shape efficiently. Yet across the plateau are dozens of straight channels, flattened surfaces, drilled depressions, and sharply defined cuts extending across large sections of exposed rock. Some grooves maintain surprisingly consistent depth over long distances, while others intersect at angles that appear intentionally geometric rather than natural. This becomes difficult to explain when compared to known Bronze Age stoneworking methods. Ancient Egyptians, for example, processed granite extensively at Aswan and inside pyramids, but they left clear chisel marks, pounding traces, and visible tool damage. Even with enormous labour forces, shaping granite was incredibly slow. experimental archaeology suggests that smoothing 1 square meter of granite using primitive hammerstones can require dozens of labor hours. At Belintash, however, flattened areas extend across tens of square meters. If all of this work was done manually, the labor investment would have been enormous for a mountain sanctuary occupied by a relatively small population. Some researchers argue that many of the formations could be natural erosion, but this explanation struggles to account for the repeated linear patterns and the organization of several channels. During heavy rain, water flows through the carved grooves in highly controlled ways, almost like a primitive hydraulic system. Certain basins fill sequentially, while others drain through narrow cut paths. This has led to theories that Belintash may have functioned not only as a ritual center, but also as a type of ceremonial water management system. That possibility is significant because advanced hydraulic engineering is usually associated with civilizations such as the Romans, Nabateans, or Maya. At sites like Petra, engineers created highly efficient water channels capable of sustaining entire desert cities. Belintash is far older and far smaller, yet some of its water flow features appear surprisingly intentional. Researchers have proposed that rainwater moving through the channels may have held ceremonial or astronomical importance, possibly linked to seasonal observations. Another unexplained feature is the series of small circular and oval depressions scattered across the plateau. Some are isolated, while others appear grouped into patterns. Local theories often describe them as star maps, suggesting they may represent constellations such as Orion or the Pleiades. While many archaeologists remain skeptical of astronomical interpretations, the geometric arrangement of certain groups continues to raise questions. Some depressions appear too regular to be random weathering, and several show signs of repeated shaping or smoothing. The problem is technological. Creating uniform depressions in granite normally requires either persistent abrasion or rotational drilling methods. Yet there is little evidence that the Thracians possessed advanced drilling technology, comparable to later Roman or Hellenistic systems. Similar debates exist at other ancient sites around the world. In Peru, polygonal stonework at Sacsayhuaman displays precision that continues to challenge modern assumptions about pre-industrial engineering. At Belintash, the mystery is smaller in scale but equally frustrating because the technical evidence appears more advanced than the surrounding archaeological culture would normally suggest. One of the most controversial mysteries involves the possibility that Belintash functioned as an astronomical observatory. Several carved lines and depressions align roughly with solar positions during equinoxes and solstices. Researchers have noted that sunlight interacts with parts of the plateau differently during specific seasons, potentially creating shadow markers or illumination points. Similar systems existed in ancient cultures worldwide. At Chichen Itza, the famous pyramid of Kukulkan creates a serpent-shaped shadow during equinoxes. At Nabta Playa, stone arrangements may have tracked seasonal celestial movements more than 6,000 years ago. But Belintash presents a problem. There is no massive architectural structure, no tower, and no obvious observatory platform. Instead, the plateau itself appears to have been modified directly into an observational surface. If intentional, it would represent a highly unusual form of prehistoric astronomical engineering integrated directly into natural geology. Geologists have also identified minor magnetic anomalies in the surrounding region. These anomalies are not extreme enough to support pseudoscientific claims about energy portals, but they are scientifically interesting because ancient cultures repeatedly selected geologically unusual sites for ritual construction. Göbekli Tepe, Delphi, and several Andean ceremonial centers were all positioned near distinctive geological formations or fault zones. Some scientists believe ancient societies may have been unusually sensitive to environmental features such as underground water movement, magnetic variation, or acoustic resonance. Acoustics may be another overlooked mystery at Belintash. Certain parts of the plateau produce unusual sound reflections due to the flat granite surfaces and surrounding cliffs. Even small voices can echo unexpectedly in particular locations. This has led some archaeologists to speculate that rituals performed there may have intentionally incorporated acoustic effects, similar to ceremonial structures found in Malta's ancient Hypogeum, where specific frequencies resonate with unusual intensity. The survival of the carvings themselves is another unresolved question. Belintash experiences harsh mountain weather, including freezing winters, strong wind exposure, and constant water erosion. Granite slowly fractures through freeze-thaw cycles, where water enters microscopic cracks, freezes, expands, and gradually breaks apart the rock. Over thousands of years, shallow carvings should become heavily degraded, yet many channels and depressions remain surprisingly visible today. This suggests two possibilities. Either the carvings were originally much deeper and more precise than they appear now, or parts of the plateau were maintained over very long periods by repeated human activity. Both explanations imply a level of long-term occupation and technical effort that archaeologists still struggle to fully reconstruct. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Belintash is not what researchers know, but what they cannot explain. The plateau contains enough evidence to confirm deliberate human modification, but not enough evidence to clearly reveal its true purpose. It may have been a Thracian sanctuary, an astronomical calendar, a ritual water system, or something combining all three. Every explanation solves one mystery while creating another. What do you think Belintash really was? An ancient observatory, a sacred ritual site, or evidence of a lost engineering knowledge far ahead of its time? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Castella de Meca sits on a rocky plateau overlooking the valleys of eastern Spain, near modern-day Ayora in the province of Valencia, and at first glance it appears to be little more than a forgotten hilltop settlement. Yet when archaeologists began studying the site in detail, they realized they were looking at something far more extraordinary. Spread across roughly 10 hectares and occupied primarily during the Iberian period, between the 5th and 1st centuries BCE, the settlement preserves one of the most unusual examples of ancient engineering in Western Europe. Unlike many ancient cities where walls and buildings dominate the landscape, Castella de Meca's greatest achievement lies in the mountain itself. Roads, reservoirs, storage areas, drainage systems, and defensive features were carved directly into solid bedrock, creating a technological landscape whose full purpose and construction methods remain only partially understood. The discovery of the site did not immediately reveal its significance. Early investigators focused on visible structures and defensive walls, assuming Castella de Meca was simply another fortified Iberian settlement. Only later did systematic surveys reveal the true scale of the engineering works. Researchers found an extensive network of roads cut directly into limestone, some preserving wheel ruts so deep and regular that they remain visible more than 2,000 years later. These features transformed Castella de Meca from an archaeological curiosity into one of the most important examples of ancient landscape engineering in the Iberian Peninsula. The most famous mystery concerns the road system itself. Throughout the settlement, deep parallel grooves cut into bedrock mark the paths once travelled by carts. Some ruts exceed 0.5 metre in depth. Archaeologists generally interpret them as the result of centuries of traffic, yet this explanation raises difficult questions. In many locations, the grooves appear remarkably regular, maintaining consistent spacing and alignment across uneven terrain. Such precision suggests that at least portions of the network may have been intentionally engineered, rather than simply worn into existence through repeated use. If these routes were deliberately planned, the implications are significant. Ancient engineers would have needed to calculate gradients, turning radii, drainage requirements, and traffic flow long before Roman road-building techniques became dominant in the region. The challenge becomes even more impressive when considering the terrain. Castella de Mecca sits atop a naturally defensive mountain environment where movement is constrained by steep slopes and exposed rock surfaces. Designing a transportation system capable of moving goods efficiently through such conditions would have required sophisticated practical knowledge of surveying and logistics. Comparisons with other ancient engineering centers highlight the puzzle. At Petra in Jordan, Nabatean engineers carved roads, water channels, and monumental facades directly into sandstone cliffs. At Machu Picchu in Peru, Inca builders reshaped entire mountainsides through terracing and carefully planned pathways. Castella de Mecca operated on a smaller scale, yet the underlying challenge was similar. In each case, engineers chose not merely to build upon a landscape, but to transform the landscape itself into an integrated technological system. Water management introduces another layer of mystery. The settlement occupies a high rocky plateau where access to permanent freshwater sources would have been limited. Yet archaeologists have documented numerous cisterns, reservoirs, channels, and collection basins carved directly into the bedrock. These installations were designed to capture and store seasonal rainfall, creating a sustainable water supply capable of supporting a substantial population. What remains uncertain is how the system was planned. Effective rainwater harvesting requires careful calculations involving catchment areas, seasonal precipitation patterns, storage capacity, evaporation rates, and overflow management. Modern hydrological studies demonstrate that even small errors in gradient can significantly reduce collection efficiency. Nevertheless, many of the reservoirs at Castella de Mecca continue to function today, demonstrating a level of engineering durability rarely associated with Iron Age societies. This raises an important question. How much mathematical and environmental knowledge did the builders possess? No surviving Iberian engineering manuals explain the design process. Archaeologists can measure the structures, estimate capacities, and reconstruct water flows, but the intellectual framework behind the system remains invisible. The engineers themselves left almost no written record explaining how these solutions were developed. Equally intriguing is the enormous amount of rock that had to be removed. Every road, reservoir, storage platform, stairway, and defensive feature required excavation directly into limestone bedrock. While no precise calculation exists for the total volume extracted, the cumulative quantity is substantial. The labor investment would have been immense, especially considering the technological limitations of the period. The Iberians possessed iron tools, but they lacked steel machinery, explosives, hydraulic drills, or mechanized excavation equipment. Yet they succeeded in reshaping large portions of an entire mountain. Similar questions arise at sites such as the rock-cut churches of Lalibela in Ethiopia and the cave complexes of Ellora in India. In each case, archaeologists can identify the finished product but struggle to reconstruct the exact methods used to achieve it. The organization required for such a project may be even more impressive than the physical construction itself. Excavation on this scale implies coordinated labor, resource management, long-term planning, and centralized authority. Workers would have needed food supplies, tool production, maintenance systems, and logistical support. The settlement therefore appears not merely as an engineering achievement, but as evidence of a highly organised society capable of managing complex projects over extended periods. Another unresolved mystery concerns the purpose of many carved features scattered throughout the site. Numerous depressions, platforms, and enclosed spaces remain difficult to interpret. Some researchers propose they functioned as storage facilities for agricultural products. Others suggest they served commercial activities, military logistics, or specialized industrial processes. Certain arrangements appear almost modern in their efficiency, leading some archaeologists to describe parts of Castellar de Mecca as resembling an ancient transport hub. The site's defensive characteristics add further complexity. Positioned high above surrounding valleys, Castellar de Mecca commanded extensive views of regional trade routes. Defensive walls, controlled access points, and naturally protected approaches indicate that security played an important role in the settlement's design. Yet the infrastructure inside the site often appears optimized for economic activity rather than purely military purposes. This dual character has fueled ongoing debate. Was Castellar de Mecca primarily a fortress, a trading center, an administrative hub, or a combination of all three? Overlooking the plains of northeastern Spain, about 30 kilometers from the Mediterranean coast in modern Catalonia, lie the ruins of Ullastret, the largest known Iberian city ever discovered. At first glance, it appears to be another Iron Age settlement, a collection of stone walls, towers, streets and houses dating back more than 2,000 years. Yet the more archaeologists study Ullastret, the more difficult questions emerge. How did a society without modern mathematics, steel machinery, written engineering manuals, or advanced surveying instruments construct a fortified urban centre capable of supporting thousands of inhabitants? And why do some of its engineering achievements seem far more sophisticated than traditionally expected for the Iberian peoples of pre-Roman Europe? The site was first identified through archaeological investigations during the 20th century, revealing the remains of a major settlement occupied between approximately the 6th and 2nd centuries BCE. Excavations uncovered an urban area covering more than 15 hectares, protected by massive fortifications and organized according to a level of planning that surprised researchers. What initially appeared to be a regional stronghold gradually revealed itself as one of the most technically impressive urban centers of ancient Iberia. One of the greatest mysteries begins with the city's location. Ullastret was built on elevated terrain that provided defensive advantages, but also created serious engineering challenges. Constructing a large settlement on uneven hillsides requires far more than simply placing stones on the ground. Builders must understand slope stability, drainage, foundation behavior, and the movement of water during seasonal storms. Modern engineers solve these problems using topographic surveys, mathematical modeling, and geotechnical analysis. The inhabitants of Ullastret possessed none of these tools, yet the city remained functional for centuries. Archaeological evidence suggests that significant portions of the settlement were carefully adapted to the natural landscape rather than simply imposed upon it. Terraces were created, foundations were adjusted to varying elevations, and urban spaces were organized in ways that minimized instability. This raises an important question. Were Iberian builders relying solely on accumulated experience? Or had they developed practical engineering principles that have been lost to history? The absence of surviving technical documents makes it difficult to determine how much of their knowledge was formalized. The city's fortification system presents an even more intriguing puzzle. Massive defensive walls surrounded the settlement, incorporating towers and gateways strategically positioned to maximize protection. Some sections of these walls reach several meters in thickness, requiring enormous quantities of stone and labor. Researchers estimate that the construction of such fortifications would have demanded the extraction, transportation and placement of thousands of tons of material. Today, moving stone on this scale requires cranes, trucks, hydraulic equipment, and detailed planning software. The people of Ullastret possessed none of these technologies. Instead, they relied entirely on human labor, simple tools, and organizational systems that remain only partially understood. Archaeologists can identify the finished structures, but reconstructing the exact logistics behind their construction remains difficult. This challenge is not unique to Ullastret. Similar questions arise at sites such as Machu Picchu in Peru, where Inca builders transported and assembled enormous stones in mountainous terrain, and at Sacsayhuaman, where some blocks exceed 100 tons. The scale at Ullastret was smaller, yet the underlying mystery remains remarkably similar. How did ancient societies consistently organize labor and resources on a scale that appears disproportionate to the technological tools available to them? Another unresolved question involves surveying accuracy. Defensive walls are most effective when positioned according to precise knowledge of terrain. Towers must cover potential blind spots. Gateways must be located where they can be defended efficiently. Lines of sight must be maintained between strategic positions. Modern military engineers calculate these factors using maps, geometry, and computer simulations. At Ullastret, the placement of defensive features often appears remarkably rational. Certain towers command broad views of surrounding approaches, while critical sectors of the landscape are monitored from elevated positions. Whether this reflects sophisticated surveying techniques or generations of accumulated practical experience remains uncertain. Water management introduces another layer of mystery. The city was not located directly beside a major river capable of supplying a large urban population. Nevertheless, archaeological excavations have revealed cisterns, storage facilities, and systems designed to collect and manage water resources. For a settlement potentially housing several thousand inhabitants, maintaining reliable access to water would have been essential. This challenge becomes even more impressive when considering climate variability. Mediterranean environments experience seasonal fluctuations in rainfall. Engineers responsible for water storage must estimate consumption, evaporation, and future needs. Modern cities use hydrological models and statistical data. The inhabitants of Ullastret relied on observation and experience. Researchers continue debating how sophisticated these systems truly were. Some argue that practical trial and error over centuries could explain their effectiveness. Others suggest that the scale of planning visible at the site implies a deeper understanding of environmental management than traditionally assumed. Similar debates occur at Petra in Jordan, where Nabatean engineers developed elaborate systems to control water in an arid landscape, and at ancient Roman cities where hydraulic infrastructure reached extraordinary levels of complexity. Urban organization presents another fascinating puzzle. Excavations indicate that streets, residential areas, storage spaces, and defensive structures were arranged according to coherent patterns rather than a random growth. This observation challenges older assumptions that Iron Age settlements expanded in a largely organic manner. In modern urban planning, organized layouts improve transportation efficiency, security, drainage, and social administration. The more researchers examine Ullastret, the more they encounter evidence suggesting that urban space was deliberately structured. Yet no surviving Iberian texts explain the principles behind these decisions. The problem becomes particularly striking when compared with other ancient civilizations. At Marzabotto in Etruscan Italy, archaeologists discovered a city built according to a carefully planned grid. At Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus Valley, standardized urban design appeared more than 4,000 years ago. At Teotihuacan in Mexico, entire districts were organized around geometric planning principles. Ullastret does not reach the same scale, but it belongs to a broader global pattern in which ancient societies repeatedly demonstrate levels of planning that seem surprisingly advanced for their era. Perhaps the most overlooked mystery concerns communication and regional coordination. Ullastret was not an isolated settlement. It functioned within a network of Iberian communities distributed across northeastern Iberia. From its elevated position, parts of the surrounding landscape remain visible for great distances. Some researchers have proposed that visual signaling systems may have connected multiple settlements. Fire beacons, smoke signals, or reflected sunlight could theoretically transmit information across considerable distances. Comparable systems are known from later civilizations, including Roman military frontiers and medieval watchtower networks. Direct evidence for such communication at Ullastret remains limited, yet the strategic placement of certain defensive positions continues to provoke debate. Overlooking the modern city of A Coruña in northwestern Spain lies Castro de Elvina, a fortified Iron Age settlement located in Galicia, less than 10 kilometers from the Atlantic Ocean. Archaeologists first identified the importance of the site in the early 20th century, and systematic excavations beginning in 1947 revealed something unexpected. Beneath layers of soil and vegetation stood the remains of a complex urban community occupied between roughly the 3rd century BCE and the early Roman period. Massive stone walls, carefully organized residential districts, sophisticated drainage systems, monumental architecture, and evidence of long-term planning emerged from the ground. What initially appeared to be a typical hill fort gradually became one of the most intriguing technological puzzles of prehistoric Iberia. The mystery is not whether the inhabitants of Elvina were capable builders. The ruins prove they were. The mystery is how a society operating without modern surveying instruments, steel tools, written engineering manuals, or advanced mathematics produced a settlement whose technical sophistication continues to surprise archaeologists today. The first challenge appears in the settlement's location. Elvina occupies elevated terrain with commanding views of the surrounding landscape. Such positions were common among the Castro culture of northwestern Iberia, yet Elvina demonstrates an unusually sophisticated adaptation to topography. The builders transformed a naturally uneven hill into a structured urban environment. Houses, streets, defensive works, and public spaces were integrated into slopes that would challenge many pre-industrial construction projects. Modern engineers understand that building on sloping terrain requires continuous management of water runoff, soil stability, and foundation pressure. Failure to account for these factors can lead to structural collapse. Yet portions of Elvina have survived more than 2,000 years despite Galicia's wet Atlantic climate. Annual rainfall in the region frequently exceeds 1,000 millimeters, creating constant erosion pressure. The survival of the settlement suggests a practical understanding of environmental engineering far beyond what is traditionally associated with Iron Age communities. The most visible mystery concerns the fortifications. Massive stone walls surround portions of the settlement, creating multiple defensive layers. These structures were not simply piles of stone stacked for protection. Their placement indicates deliberate exploitation of terrain, visibility, and movement routes. Military historians often compare defensive systems according to how effectively they control access points. At Elvina, attackers approaching uphill would encounter successive obstacles, while defenders retained advantageous sightlines. Similar principles appear in later Roman fortifications and medieval castles. The difference is chronological. Many of the engineering concepts visible at Elvina emerged centuries before medieval military architecture developed comparable solutions. Archaeologists continue debating how the builders planned these defenses. Today, such projects would begin with maps, measurements, and geometric calculations. No evidence of formal engineering documents survives from Elvina. Nevertheless, the finished results suggest systematic planning rather than trial-and-error construction. The walls appear where they are most effective, not where construction would have been easiest. Equally fascinating is the settlement's internal organisation. Popular imagination often portrays Iron Age villages as collections of houses that expanded randomly over time. Elvina challenges this assumption. Excavations reveal recurring spatial patterns, organised circulation routes, and districts that appear intentionally structured. Researchers have noted that movement through the settlement was controlled in surprisingly sophisticated ways. Certain routes channel visitors towards specific areas while restricting direct access to others. Such planning resembles principles visible in urban centres throughout the ancient world. At sites like Marzabotto in Etruria or certain sectors of Roman military camps, circulation itself became part of the architecture. Elvina appears to employ similar concepts despite emerging from an entirely different cultural tradition. This raises a difficult question. How did the inhabitants maintain urban consistency across generations without surviving written plans? The archaeological evidence suggests standardization. Standardization is one of the defining characteristics of advanced engineering because it allows builders to reproduce successful designs repeatedly. Yet the intellectual framework behind that standardization remains invisible. The most famous structure at Elvina deepens the mystery further. Known as the Casa de la Exedra, it differs dramatically from ordinary domestic buildings. Its unusual design, monumental appearance, and architectural complexity have generated decades of debate. Some scholars interpret it as the residence of a local elite. Others suggest ceremonial functions. A few researchers have proposed administrative or political roles. None of these explanations fully account for its distinctive architecture. What makes the building remarkable is not merely its size, but its construction quality. The structure demonstrates planning, labour investment, and technical competence, exceeding what would be necessary for ordinary housing. Similar questions arise at other ancient sites where singular buildings stand apart from surrounding architecture. At Machu Picchu, researchers debate specialized functions of certain elite compounds. At Chaco Canyon, monumental structures appear to have served multiple purposes simultaneously. Casa de la Exedra may represent a comparable phenomenon in Atlantic Europe. Another unresolved puzzle concerns stoneworking technology. Granite dominates the geology of Galicia and forms the foundation of much of Elvina's architecture. Granite is durable but notoriously difficult to shape. Even with modern equipment, quarrying and transporting large blocks demands substantial effort. The builders of Elvina possessed neither steel-cutting equipment nor mechanized transport, yet they successfully extracted, moved, and assembled enormous quantities of stone. Archaeological experiments at comparable sites suggest that transporting blocks weighing several hundred kilograms could require dozens of workers using ropes, wooden rollers, sledges, and carefully coordinated labor. The challenge becomes even more impressive when considering elevation changes. Every stone incorporated into walls, houses, and public structures had to be moved uphill. This logistical problem resembles questions raised at hilltop sites throughout the ancient world. Researchers studying Sacsayhuaman in Peru, the hill forts of Britain, and the Oppidar of Celtic Europe repeatedly confront the same issue. The architecture survives. The exact methods remain partially hidden. Water management presents perhaps the strongest evidence for sophisticated practical knowledge. Heavy rainfall creates severe challenges for any hilltop settlement. Without effective drainage, roads deteriorate, foundations weaken, and retaining structures fail. Excavations at Elvina reveal evidence that runoff was carefully controlled. Streets appear positioned to direct water flow. Building placement reflects awareness of drainage patterns. Certain areas show signs of intentional engineering intended to reduce erosion. Modern hydrological models demonstrate that even small alterations in surface gradients can dramatically affect water behavior. Whether the builders understood these effects mathematically is unknown. What is clear is that they understood them practically. Their solutions worked. The Roman period adds another layer of complexity. Elvina did not disappear immediately following Roman expansion into northwestern Iberia. Instead, evidence suggests continuity and adaptation. Indigenous traditions persisted while Roman influence gradually increased. This creates an intriguing technological question. Did local builders adopt Roman techniques? Or did Roman engineers encounter existing knowledge systems worth preserving? Archaeology increasingly suggests that cultural exchange rarely moves in only one direction. Similar patterns appear throughout the Roman world, where indigenous expertise often influenced imperial practices. Perhaps the greatest mystery of Castro de Elvina is not architectural but intellectual. Archaeologists possess walls, houses, drainage systems, roads, and monumental buildings. They can measure dimensions, analyze construction methods, and reconstruct development phases. What they cannot fully reconstruct is the knowledge itself. On a rocky hill overlooking the Mediterranean coast near modern-day Alicante, Spain, lies Tossal de Manises, the archaeological remains of ancient Lucentum. Today, visitors see weathered walls, fragmented streets, and scattered foundations. Yet beneath these ruins lies a puzzle that continues to challenge archaeologists. More than 2,000 years ago, builders transformed a strategic coastal ridge into a fortified urban centre that controlled trade routes, monitored maritime traffic, managed water resources, and defended itself against invasion. The city was not enormous by Roman standards, but what makes Tossal de Manises remarkable is the sophistication hidden within its design. The surviving stones suggest a level of planning, surveying, and engineering that appears surprisingly advanced for its era, while many of the technical methods behind its construction remain only partially understood. The site became widely recognized through archaeological excavations conducted during the 20th century, although references to ancient remains had existed much earlier. Located approximately 3 kilometers northeast of Alicante's historic center, the settlement occupied a naturally elevated position overlooking the Bay of Alicante. From this vantage point, inhabitants could observe approaching ships, monitor commercial activity, and defend one of the most strategically valuable stretches of coastline in southeastern Iberia. Archaeological evidence indicates that the settlement evolved from an Iberian community before becoming integrated into the Roman world. What researchers discovered beneath centuries of accumulated soil was not merely a collection of buildings, but a carefully organized urban system. The first mystery begins with the location itself. Modern geographic analysis demonstrates that Tossal de Manises occupies an exceptionally advantageous position. The hill provides visibility across large sections of the coastline while remaining close to agricultural land, freshwater sources, and maritime routes. Such a combination would be considered ideal even by modern urban planners. Today, geographic information systems can model visibility, transportation efficiency, and defensive advantages using powerful computers. Ancient builders possessed none of these technologies, yet they selected a site whose strategic characteristics remain impressive more than 2 millennia later. Whether this choice emerged from generations of accumulated local knowledge or from sophisticated surveying practices remains uncertain. The layout of the city introduces another fascinating puzzle. Excavations reveal evidence of organized streets, residential districts, public spaces, and defensive structures arranged according to coherent planning principles. Urban planning of this kind requires far more than simply constructing buildings wherever space is available. Streets must align with terrain. Drainage must function across multiple elevations. Defensive walls must integrate with the natural landscape. Every major structure must fit within a larger system. Archaeologists studying Lucentum frequently note the presence of recurring spatial patterns, suggesting that surveyors worked according to standardized measurements and predetermined plans. This raises an important question. How precise were ancient surveyors? Roman engineers are known to have employed instruments such as the groma for establishing straight lines and right angles. However, the surviving evidence at Tossal de Manises suggests a degree of consistency that still impresses modern researchers. Even small measurement errors become magnified when repeated across an entire city. Yet many sectors of the settlement display remarkable organization. Similar challenges appear at Roman colonial cities throughout the Mediterranean, but Lucentum presents an especially interesting case because its planners had to adapt their designs to an irregular coastal ridge rather than a flat plain. Balancing geometric order against difficult terrain requires considerable technical skill. The defensive system presents perhaps the most visually striking engineering mystery. Portions of the city's fortifications reveal a sophisticated understanding of military architecture. Rather than forming a simple enclosure, sections of the walls appear designed to maximize observation and defensive effectiveness. Angled segments, carefully positioned towers, and strategic sightlines suggest deliberate planning. Military engineers throughout history have understood that geometry can be as important as raw strength. A properly placed tower can eliminate blind spots. A carefully angled wall can expose attackers to crossfire. At Tossal de Manises, some of these principles appear centuries before the highly developed bastion systems of the Renaissance. Comparisons with other ancient fortifications are revealing. At sites such as Sacsayhuaman in Peru, researchers marvel at stonework precision. At the walls of Avila in Spain, attention focuses on the scale of the defensive circuit. At Tossal de Manises, the mystery centers less on monumental size and more on intelligent integration between architecture and terrain. The city appears designed not simply to resist attack, but to exploit the landscape itself as part of the defensive system. Water management introduces another layer of complexity. Every ancient city depended on reliable control of water. Too little water threatened survival. Too much water threatened infrastructure. Coastal settlements faced additional challenges, including erosion, seasonal rainfall, and drainage across uneven ground. Archaeologists have identified channels, collection systems, and hydraulic features that indicate substantial planning. The remarkable aspect is not merely that these systems existed, but that they functioned effectively within a complicated topographical environment. Hydraulic engineering remains one of the least appreciated achievements of the ancient world. Modern drainage systems rely on precise calculations involving flow rates, gradients, sediment transport, and erosion control. Ancient engineers lacked modern mathematics and computer simulations, yet many Roman and pre-Roman hydraulic systems operated successfully for centuries. Similar mysteries appear at Petra in Jordan, where Nabatean engineers controlled flash floods, and at Machu Picchu, where Inca drainage systems continue functioning after 500 years. Tossal de Manises belongs to this broader tradition of ancient hydraulic expertise that often exceeds popular expectations. Another unresolved question concerns construction logistics. Every visible wall required quarrying, transportation, shaping, and placement. The process demanded coordination of labor, materials, and engineering knowledge. Unlike modern construction projects, ancient builders lacked mechanized cranes, powered vehicles, steel machinery, and hydraulic lifting equipment. Nevertheless, large-scale urban construction occurred repeatedly throughout the Mediterranean world. The challenge becomes especially intriguing when examining the durability of surviving structures. Coastal environments are notoriously destructive. Salt carried by sea air accelerates deterioration. Moisture penetrates stone. Temperature fluctuations create stress within building materials. Yet portions of Lakentum's infrastructure survived more than 2,000 years. This longevity raises questions about material selection, masonry techniques, and environmental knowledge. Did builders understand which stone types would best resist marine conditions? Were construction methods refined through centuries of experimentation? Archaeologists can analyze the results, but reconstructing the exact decision-making process remains difficult. Trade networks provide another dimension of the mystery. Excavations have uncovered evidence connecting Lucentum to wider Mediterranean commerce. Goods, materials, and cultural influences arrived from distant regions. Such connections required navigation across open waters without magnetic compasses, GPS systems, radar, or accurate longitude measurements. Ancient mariners relied on celestial navigation, coastal landmarks, prevailing winds, and accumulated experience. Historians continue debating how precise these methods truly were, yet the archaeological record demonstrates repeated success. Trade functioned across hundreds and sometimes thousands of kilometers. The implications extend beyond economics. Long-distance commerce also facilitated the movement of technical knowledge. Engineering methods, architectural concepts, military innovations, and surveying techniques could spread through interconnected trade networks. Some researchers suspect that Lakentum may have benefited from this exchange of expertise, though determining exactly how knowledge traveled remains challenging. In the volcanic valleys of southern Tuscany, Italy, lies Savannah, a place where ancient engineers cut roads directly into solid rock so deeply and so precisely that even modern archaeologists still debate how they achieved it more than 2,000 years ago. Although the settlement itself was known throughout history, systematic archaeological investigation accelerated during the 19th and 20th centuries when researchers began documenting the vast Etruscan necropolis surrounding Savannah. What initially appeared to be a collection of tombs soon revealed something far more extraordinary: an immense network of sunken roads, monumental rock-cut architecture, and engineering works carved directly into volcanic stone. What archaeologists discovered was not merely a cemetery, it was an engineered landscape. The ancient Etruscans flourished in central Italy between roughly the 8th and 3rd centuries BCE, long before Rome became the dominant power of the Mediterranean. Many ancient civilizations built monuments. The Egyptians built pyramids, the Greeks built temples, and the Romans built aqueducts. The Etruscans at Savannah appear to have done something different. Rather than placing structures onto the landscape, they transformed the landscape itself. Across the valleys surrounding Savannah, researchers have identified numerous rock-cut tombs connected by an extensive system of excavated corridors known as V-cave. These passageways were not simply carved into existing cracks or ravines. In many locations, they were deliberately excavated through solid volcanic tuff, creating vertical walls that rise 10 to 20 meters above the pathways below. Standing inside one of these corridors feels less like walking through a road and more like moving through a gigantic artificial canyon. The scale alone raises questions. Thousands of cubic meters of stone had to be removed, every wall had to remain stable, every route had to maintain usable gradients, And all of this was accomplished without explosives, steel tools, engines, cranes, or modern surveying equipment. Among all the unanswered questions surrounding Savannah, perhaps none is more fascinating than the apparent sophistication of Etruscan surveying. Modern engineers understand how difficult it is to establish long, consistent alignments across uneven terrain, and today we rely on total stations, GPS receivers, laser scanners, satellite imagery, and digital terrain models. The builders of Savannah possessed none of these technologies, yet many via cave display remarkable directional consistency. Researchers studying Etruscan landscapes have noted that these routes frequently maintain logical connections between settlements, agricultural zones, sacred areas, and necropolises, appearing integrated into a larger regional plan rather than being created randomly over time. This creates a difficult question. How did Etruscan engineers determine where to excavate? To carve a corridor through solid rock, surveyors must first establish a route, estimating elevation changes, drainage behavior, geological stability, and future usability, where any major error could multiply into thousands of hours of wasted labor. Even a deviation of a few degrees could dramatically alter the final path, yet many of these corridors follow terrain with impressive efficiency. Some researchers suggest that the Etruscans employed sophisticated geometric surveying methods using ropes, sighting poles, plumb lines, and astronomical observations, while others believe generations of accumulated practical experience allowed them to achieve surprising accuracy. The problem is that no surviving technical manuals explain their procedures. The roads survive, but the calculations do not. The engineering challenge becomes even more impressive when considering the sheer amount of material removed. A typical V cave may extend hundreds of meters while reaching heights of 10 to 20 meters, and even conservative estimates suggest that many thousands of tons of rock were excavated. For comparison, modern construction projects involving comparable volumes would normally employ hydraulic excavators, drilling equipment, dump trucks, and laser-guided surveying systems. The Etruscans relied primarily on human labor. Archaeologists have identified tool marks on various rock surfaces, demonstrating systematic excavation techniques, yet the exact organization of labor remains unclear. Questions persist. How many workers participated? How long did individual corridors require? How was debris removed from narrow excavation zones? And where was the excavated stone deposited? Surprisingly, answers remain incomplete. The physical evidence proves the work occurred, but the logistics remain elusive. The volcanic tuff underlying Savannah is relatively soft when freshly exposed, but becomes more durable after weathering, a property that undoubtedly aided excavation. However, it does not fully explain the survival of the corridors. Many walls remain standing after more than 2 millennia, suggesting that the builders understood far more about geology than is often assumed. When modern engineers cut into slopes, they analyze fracture systems, water infiltration, slope stability, load distribution, and erosion potential, as mistakes can trigger collapses. The Etruscans apparently achieved large-scale excavations while avoiding catastrophic structural failures across much of the landscape. This raises an intriguing possibility. Perhaps ancient builders possessed extensive empirical geological knowledge acquired through generations of quarrying, mining, and construction. They may not have possessed geological science in the modern sense, but they may have understood the behavior of local rock formations with extraordinary practical precision, and the surviving corridors themselves may be evidence of that expertise. One of the most overlooked mysteries of Savannah involves water. At first glance, the V cave appear vulnerable. Deep trenches should collect rainfall, standing water should accelerate erosion, and seasonal flooding should damage the corridors. yet many remain surprisingly stable. Researchers have identified drainage features integrated into various sections of the landscape, where subtle gradients encourage runoff and natural channels appear incorporated into broader designs. In some locations, erosion seems far less severe than expected given the age of the structures. The situation resembles challenges encountered at sites such as Machu Picchu, Petra, and the underground cities of Cappadocia, where water management appears inseparable from architectural survival. Without effective drainage, none of these sites should have endured for centuries. Savannah belongs within this same category of ancient engineering puzzles, and its builders seem to have understood hydrology well enough to protect massive, excavated features across extremely long periods of time. The tombs of Savannah introduce another layer of complexity. The most famous example, the tomb of Hildebranda, resembles a classical temple emerging from a hillside. What makes this structure remarkable is the method of construction. The builders did not assemble columns and walls from separate blocks, but instead removed the surrounding rock, meaning everything visible today was created by subtraction. Columns, stairways, chambers, decorative elements, and architectural facades were all carved from a single geological mass. This process required extraordinary planning, as a mason assembling blocks can replace damaged components, but a rock-cut architect cannot, and one major mistake can destroy years of work. Similar challenges appear at Petra in Jordan, the rock-cut churches of Lalibela in Ethiopia, and India's Kailasa temple. Yet Savannah remains distinctive because such techniques were applied across an entire funerary landscape rather than a single isolated monument. What do you think was the true purpose of the giant V cave corridors of Savannah? Transportation, ritual processions, astronomical design, or something we still haven't discovered? Share your theory in the comments below. Incalashta lies high in the eastern Andes of Bolivia at an elevation of nearly 2,950 meters above sea level. Hidden between steep mountain ridges and dry valleys, the site was first documented by Spanish chroniclers in the 16th century, but serious archaeological investigation did not begin until the early 20th century. Today, researchers consider Incalashta one of the largest and most mysterious Inca sites ever discovered outside modern Peru. The city covers more than 80 hectares and contains massive stone walls, ceremonial plazas, agricultural terraces, storage facilities, and military structures. What makes Incalashta unusual is its location. Unlike Machu Picchu, which was hidden deep within isolated mountains, Incalashta stood directly on the dangerous frontier between the Inca Empire and the eastern lowland tribes, especially the fierce Chiriguano warriors. This was not simply a ceremonial city. It was a strategic fortress placed at the edge of an empire that controlled almost 4,000 kilometers of South America. But the deeper archaeologists studied Incalashta, the stranger the site became. One of the greatest mysteries surrounding Incalashta is how the Inca managed to construct such a massive complex on unstable mountainous terrain without iron tools, wheeled transport, or modern engineering equipment. Many of the surviving walls still stand after more than 500 years of earthquakes, seasonal flooding, and temperature fluctuations. Some stone blocks were shaped so precisely that even modern measuring tools reveal gaps of only a few millimeters between surfaces. Similar techniques are found at Sacsayhuaman in Peru, where stones weighing more than 100 tons fit together with astonishing precision. However, Incalashta presents an additional challenge. The entire complex was built on sloped terrain vulnerable to erosion and seismic activity. Modern engineers studying Inca masonry discovered that many walls were intentionally tilted slightly inward. This subtle angle distributed seismic energy throughout the structure during earthquakes. In laboratory simulations, researchers found that polygonal Inca stonework absorbed vibration significantly better than rigid European masonry from the same historical period. Yet the biggest question remains unanswered. How were these stones transported across steep mountain terrain? Some quarries linked to Incalajta are located kilometers away from the main complex. Moving multi-ton blocks uphill without wheels or draft animals capable of carrying heavy loads would have required extraordinary coordination and manpower. Experimental archaeologists attempting to recreate similar transportation methods discovered that even moving stones weighing 2 to 3 tons over rough slopes required dozens of workers using ropes, ramps, and wooden rollers. Incalajta contained stones far larger than that. The most mysterious structure at Incalajta is the gigantic Calanca, a rectangular hall measuring approximately 78 meters long and more than 25 meters wide. It is believed to be one of the largest roofed buildings ever constructed by the Inca civilization. This immediately creates a major engineering mystery. The stone foundations and column bases indicate the building once supported a massive roof structure, but constructing a roof of that scale at high altitude would have been extraordinarily difficult. Strong Andean winds, seasonal storms, and dramatic temperature changes would place enormous stress on wooden support beams. Archaeologists estimate that the roof may have required hundreds of massive timber beams. The problem is that large trees do not naturally grow at that elevation. The wood likely came from distant subtropical forests east of the Andes, possibly transported from regions dozens of kilometers away. Even today, transporting heavy timber through those mountain routes without roads would be extremely difficult. Some researchers estimate that the labor force required for the Calanca alone may have numbered in the thousands. What confuses experts even more is the purpose of such a colossal hall. The structure was far larger than most known military barracks. Some believe it functioned as a ceremonial gathering center, capable of hosting political assemblies, rituals, or elite administrative meetings. Others argue it may have been designed to demonstrate imperial power near the empire's frontier. But no definitive answer exists. Like many major Inca sites, Incalajta appears to contain sophisticated astronomical alignments. Several doorways and walls line up with the position of the sun during solstices and equinoxes. Researchers studying the site noticed that sunlight passes through specific openings at precise seasonal moments, illuminating ceremonial sectors of the complex. This suggests Incalajta may have functioned partly as an astronomical observatory. The challenge is understanding how the Inca achieved this level of accuracy. The mountainous terrain surrounding the city creates distorted horizons that complicate solar observations, yet the alignments remain remarkably precise. At Machu Picchu, similar solar alignments have an error margin of less than 1 degree. Some researchers believe Incalajta may have achieved comparable precision using only naked eye astronomy and horizon markers. This required advanced long-term observation of celestial cycles. The Inca possessed no written mathematical system comparable to Greek astronomy, yet they successfully integrated solar tracking into architecture across thousands of kilometers of mountainous terrain. Even more mysterious is the possibility that Incalajta's ceremonial layout mirrored cosmological beliefs tied to the Milky Way, which the Inca considered a sacred celestial river. Some archaeologists argue the city's orientation reflects symbolic connections between the heavens and imperial authority. Perhaps the most underrated mystery of Incalajta is its water management system. The region experiences extreme seasonal variation. During rainy periods, water descends violently from surrounding mountains. During dry seasons, water becomes scarce. Yet the Inca engineered a network of canals, terraces, drainage channels, and reservoirs capable of stabilizing agricultural production. Some channels still function today after centuries of abandonment. Modern hydraulic engineers studying Inca systems discovered that many channels maintained incredibly precise gradients. If the slope was too steep, water would erode the stone lining. If too shallow, the flow would stagnate. In several sections of Incalajta, the gradient varies by only tiny fractions across long distances. This precision becomes even more astonishing considering the lack of modern surveying instruments. The agricultural terraces surrounding the city also reveal sophisticated environmental adaptation. By creating stepped farming platforms, the Inca reduced erosion while maximizing water retention. Similar systems across the Andes remain agriculturally productive after hundreds of years. NASA researchers studying ancient agricultural resilience have even compared Andean terrace systems to sustainable farming solutions for harsh environments today. At first glance, Incalajta appears to be a military fortress built to defend the eastern border of the Inca Empire. Massive defensive walls and strategic positioning support that theory. However, the city contains an unusually high concentration of ceremonial architecture. Large plazas, ritual spaces, sacred alignments, and elite compounds suggest Incalajta served functions far beyond warfare. Some historians believe the site acted as both a military command center and a symbolic demonstration of imperial control over frontier populations. This dual purpose may explain its immense scale. Unlike isolated fortresses designed purely for defense, Incalajta projected political and spiritual authority. It represented the physical edge of one of the largest empires in pre-Columbian America, an empire controlling nearly 12 million people at its peak. The city may have been intended to intimidate neighboring tribes not only with military strength, but with architecture itself. One of the strangest aspects of Incalajta is evidence suggesting parts of the city were never fully completed. Some structures appear unfinished. Certain walls abruptly stop. Construction zones show signs of sudden interruption. Archaeologists believe major building activity may have ceased rapidly during the early 16th century. Then the city was abandoned. The arrival of the Spanish dramatically destabilized the Inca Empire after the capture of Emperor Atahualpa in 1532. Civil war, disease, and political collapse spread across the Andes within only a few decades. But some researchers suspect Incalajta's abandonment may have started even earlier due to pressure from Chiriguano invasions. Historical accounts describe repeated attacks on Inca frontier settlements in this region. If true, Incalajta may represent a massive imperial project interrupted before completion, a frontier mega-city abandoned during the collapse of an empire.